All fine then. Okay, great. Low volume, yaar. I'm deliberately also speaking in a low volume because high volume पे डर लगने लगता है. Human mind tells कि आराम से बोलो ठीक हो जाएगा. Human mind. चलो. Today don't give break. चलो, we'll see about that. So let's start. Ruchi, please send the questions again because we had to restart the system. So the browser has closed and therefore the questions are gone. चलो, let's start. गुड हेयर स्टाइल क्या यार, पिछले 10-15 दिनों से ऐसे ही हूं मैं. गुड हेयर स्टाइल मजे ले रहे हो तुम मेरे. So to quickly recap, I just quickly recapped what we did last time, है ना. So I just said we discussed different types of banks. We discussed universal versus differentiated bank. A universal bank is the bank which performs all the functions which a bank can perform, whereas a differentiated bank performs only certain functions, specific functions. That is what a differentiated bank is versus a universal bank. We discussed small finance banks, payments banks, wholesale banks, custodian banks. Briefly, we discussed all these things. We also discussed then commercial versus cooperative. Commercial bank is the bank whose motive is to make profits, whereas cooperative bank doesn't make profit as a primary objective. Their primary objective is not to make profit. Their primary objective is to make sure that money is available to all the depositors whenever they need it. If somebody needs it, money is available. That is what cooperative. They may make profits. Sometimes they do also make profits, but that is not the primary objective. Scheduled versus non-scheduled. Any bank which has to perform banking operations, any entity, I should not have said bank, any entity, any financial entity, any company which has to perform banking operations in the country must take license from RBI to perform those banking operations. If you don't take license from RBI and you're performing operations which are of banking in nature, then you are not allowed to do that. अगर किसी कंपनी को has to perform any kind of banking activity, it must take license from RBI. देखो, that doesn't mean that I cannot give my money to somebody else. That doesn't mean that. अगर मुझे अपना पैसा किसी को देना है उधार पे, मैं दे सकता हूं अपना पैसा किसी को उधार पे. That doesn't mean that somebody else cannot give their money to me. You please keep my money as deposit. Obviously, people keep on doing it. It's not illegal. But if you are a company and you want to perform these operations as your activity, then you'll have to go and take bank license from RBI. Amongst all the banks which get license from RBI, most of them find themselves in Schedule 2 of Banking Regulation Act. Most of them, almost 99.9% banks are there which are part of second schedule of Banking Regulation Act. Those banks are called scheduled bank. You'll find commercial banks as scheduled bank. You'll find cooperative banks, urban cooperative, rural cooperative. You'll find all these banks as part of scheduled bank, as in that list. You'll find all the differentiated banks, small banks, payment banks. Most of them would be part of Schedule 2 of Banking Regulation Act. But there are some banks which are not part of the schedule. Banks which are not part of the schedule, meaning what? They have gotten a license from RBI to perform banking operations. Still, they are not included in that second schedule of Banking Regulation Act. Such banks are called non-scheduled banks. उनको बोलते हैं non-scheduled banks. Last time बताया भी था, if you are a scheduled bank, that means you have got more responsibilities. Therefore your scope of operations, your liabilities are bigger, and therefore your operations are of bigger scale. Non-scheduled bank, you get less support from RBI, you get less facilities from RBI. So that is non-scheduled banks. We discussed merchant banks or investment banks. Merchant banks concept, merchant banks, investment banks. These are the banks which primarily cater to commercial sector. They don't cater to retail sector. They cater primarily to commercial sectors. They advise companies on mergers and acquisitions. They advise companies on where they can arrange money at low cost from. So that is what merchant banks do. Then we discussed regional banks, regional rural banks, and we discussed in RRBs. In 1970s, government said that we need to set up banking system in rural areas as well. Rural areas are unbanked, therefore we need to provide banking services to rural population as well. And therefore government set up regional rural banks. RRBs were set up with the help of central government. To set up a bank, central government, to set up a regional rural bank, central bank provided 50% of funding. The sponsor bank, there would be one sponsor bank. That sponsor bank provided 35% of funding and 15% of funding came from state government, and therefore RRBs were set up, regional rural banks. हमने लीड बैंक स्कीम भी डिस्कस किया था, LBS. लीड बैंक स्कीम क्या है? लीड बैंक स्कीम है simply it's a scheme in which a leading bank of a region takes initiatives with help of other banks in that region of how to further financial inclusion. That is what lead bank scheme is. क्वेश्चन पूछा गया था प्रीलिम्स में, आई थिंक 3 या 4 साल पहले, लीड बैंक स्कीम के ऊपर. So which of the following is an area based approach? Area based approach, the answer was lead bank scheme. That is why I included it. I'll tell you what lead bank scheme is. I'll tell you what area based approach is. I'll tell you about that. Today we will discuss, these were very basic aspects of banking. InPay, I don't want to dictate notes on these things. These are quite basic. There is nothing for me to dictate. I mean, if you will insist, then I will have to, ठीक है, मेरे को करना पड़ेगा. But these are quite basic. I'll please suggest that you read from your printed material regarding what these banks are. In fact, अगर मैं आपको notes दूंगा भी तो मैं आपको ये बोलूंगा कि small finance banks and payments bank, please read from your printed material because there would be more elaborate details regarding these two banks on which questions are asked. As I said last time also, that in your exam, in prelims examination, since 2014, जब से small finance and payments bank setup किए गए थे, since then, every year, without any exception, every year a question has been asked on SFBs and PBs. Every year a question has been asked. Small finance और payments bank के ऊपर, कई बार same question में, कई बार अलग-अलग question में. Every year they have asked a question. So these are quite important. Please read about them from your printed material. As in what can they do, what they cannot do. I explained it to you last time. मैंने आपको last time explain कर दिया था. But it's too basic and too factual for me to dictate. Too basic and too factual. It is there in your printed material. Please spare me this. Please, इतना spare कर सकते हो. Please write it down or please read it on your own from your printed material. There it is given in quite elaborate detail. ठीक है? Today what we are going to discuss. Today we will discuss more important aspects regarding banking. Mains topics. Today we are going to discuss more of mains topics. Some question जैसे बैंक nationalization के ऊपर they have asked a question in prelims. Financial inclusion में they have asked question from जनधन, प्रधानमंत्री जनधन योजना, from financial inclusion और बैंक nationalization, दोनों का similar side topic है. They have asked question in prelims from this. They have asked question in prelims from priority sector lending, shortfalls in PSL. They have asked question from this also in prelims. So prelims में भी they ask questions from these. Mains में there is a more probability that question may be asked. Mains में they have asked question from financial inclusion. What do you understand by financial inclusion? What is financial inclusion? They have asked question in mains from this part. They can certainly ask, एक essay पूछा जा सकता है, और they can ask a question in 2019 में we had, जैसे बोलते हैं ना, 50 years of bank nationalization. So this anniversary of bank nationalization 1969 1970, तो 2020 से 1970 से 2020, 1969 1970 2019 2020, 50 years of bank nationalization. So they may ask a question regarding bank nationalization also. Priority sector lending, I don't think so question in mains may be asked, but prelims mein to it keeps on getting repeated again and again. So today we'll discuss we'll spend most of our time on discussing these aspects. So let's start. First, we'll discuss what financial inclusion is. I've been using this term financial inclusion repeatedly. Then we'll discuss, within our discussion on financial inclusion, we'll discuss priority sector lending and shortfalls in priority sector lending. And then we'll discuss bank nationalization. तब हम bank nationalization discuss करेंगे. ठीक है? अच्छा, one more thing, please चलो I'll ask after the class के बाद बोलूँगा, class के बाद, अभी नहीं. चलो, let's start with our discussion on financial inclusion first. First we'll discuss this, then we'll discuss priority sector lending, and then we'll discuss bank nationalization. ठीक है? ऐसे discuss करेंगे. So first, financial inclusion. So I've been talking about financial inclusion. I've been using this word financial inclusion since last class when we started with our banking, especially in the context of regional rural banks, RRBs. Question is asked, what is financial inclusion? In fact, this question was asked from me in my interview as well. मेरे से इंटरव्यू में पूछा गया था कि financial inclusion बताओ क्या होता है, and I was prepared. ठीक है? I was prepared. Financial inclusion क्या होता है, तो मैंने बहुत अच्छे से बताया और मेरे इंटरव्यू में बड़े अच्छे नंबर आए थे. बट हाँ, बाकी सब्जेक्ट्स में कम थे तो इसलिए I couldn't. Anyways, so financial inclusion, this is something that they have asked this in mains, especially after Jan Dhan Yojana, they have asked financial inclusion. More than once it has been asked. So it's a really important topic, what financial inclusion is. So financial inclusion, what is meant by this term financial? I'll answer your questions. I've read your questions. I'll answer your questions. Don't worry. मैं बताता हूं अभी आपके क्वेश्चंस का आंसर भी देता हूं. What financial inclusion is? Financial inclusion doesn't simply mean having a bank account. Financial inclusion does not mean that I have a bank account in my name in Punjab National Bank, which is located 20 kilometers away from my place. That is not financial inclusion. Financial inclusion has 4 important pillars. 4 important pillars हैं financial inclusion के. Financial inclusion has 4 important pillars. 4 pillars of financial inclusion. Financial inclusion means being able to, listen carefully everybody, I'll dictate. ये part मैं dictate करूंगा. All these things I'll dictate. First वाली slide I'll not dictate, but this part, ये जो important part है, PSL, nationalization में some part I'll dictate, and financial inclusion, these parts I'll dictate. So don't worry, don't need to write. Please listen to me. What is financial inclusion? Financial inclusion होता क्या है? Financial inclusion is having access to financial services. Listen carefully everybody. Having access to financial services at an affordable cost at required time. Access to financial services at affordable cost and required time or requisite time. Access to financial services. Access to financial services. Now what is this access to financial services? A person who lives in a village, if he wants loan, he can get loan from the local money lender. There was a senior in our college. He came from Bharatpur, Rajasthan UP border, Bharatpur, Agra ke paas Bharatpur. He came from Bharatpur and he told us that he had taken loan in order to prepare for JEE and all. He had taken loan and he had taken loan at a rate of 25%. 25% ब्याज पे उसने लोन लिया था. 25% was the rate of interest that his family was paying on the loan for his education. So money was available to him by a money lender, by a local money lender, but money was available to him at a very high cost. At the same time, he had girvi rakhna. He had put as collateral, put as security, or his family had put as security whatever small piece of land that they had put that small piece of land as a security, that in case he is not able to return 25% whatever loan they had taken with 25% interest, if he is not able to return, then it has their land is kept as a collateral there. At an affordable cost at a required time. Access to financial services. I'll explain all these points, but first understand the gravity of this term financial inclusion. If we look at share of credit, share of institutional credit in total rural lending, First understand this. If we look at the share of institutional credit in total rural lending, अगर रूरल एरिया में 100 रुपए लोन पे दिए जा रहे हैं, if in rural areas 100, if in a rural area 100 rupees are being lent in total, then out of those 100 rupees, which institution has how much share? Institutional share in rural credit, share of institutional credit in total rural lending. समझ में आया क्या? हम क्या चीज देख रहे हैं? What are we going to look at? We are looking at institutional share institution wise share in the total rural credit? If 100 rupees are lent, how much of them come from banks? How much of them comes from NBFCs, for example? How much of them come from money lender? कहां से कितना पैसा आ रहा है? How much of money is coming from institutional sources, institutions, financial institutions, that means which are registered, regulated financial institutions by RBI, by SEBI, whoever, and via unregistered, unregulated money lender. Who is lending how much out of the total 100 rupees that is lent in a rural area? If we look at this, if we look at these 100 rupees, or if we look at the share of institutions in rural lending, you can certainly draw this graph in your exam also. अगर हम इंडिपेंडेंस के बाद से देखें, at the time of independence, institutional lending, that means lending by banks or financial institutions, comprised merely of about 8% of total rural lending. इसको मैं थोड़ा zoom कर सकता, I'll write it in a bigger font a little bit. Institutional lending comprised only about 8% at the time of independence, and 92% of lending was non-institutional. Institutional matlab by banks, by formal institutions. Non-institutional by money lenders, zamindar, patidar, money lenders. So who is lending them? At the time of independence, 92% of lending in rural areas came from these people. Only 8% came from institutional sources. Over a period of time, its share declined. But share decline did not happen all of a sudden. Share decline happened very slowly, बहुत slowly. In fact, share of non-institutional sources starts to decline only after 1970s. 1970 के बाद share of non-institutional sources in total rural lending starts to decline. It picks up pace in 1980s. 1980s में इसकी pace और बढ़ती है. And then it comes down fast, and then it has stabilized. आज की तारीख में it has stabilized. Opposite mirror image would be the graph of institutional lending. Institutional lending was also very less for a long time, starts to pick up in 70s, gains pace in 80s, and now it has stabilized like this. Today, about 70% of total rural lending is from institutional sources, and about 30%. Today it is even less. This graph is quite old. This graph is in the pre-Jan Dhan era. So this graph is quite old now. But it would have been certainly have come down, but still relevant. Today, institutional sources. ये वाली line is institutional sources, and this is non-institutional sources. Non-institutional sources. Share of institutional sources has increased from 8% to about 70% today. It has stabilized. It's still growing, but it has stabilized, or it's growing at a very slow pace now. And share of non-institutional sources has come down to about 30% today. Still, it's a big share, non-institutional sources, but today it's quite less as compared to what it used to be before. That means even today about 30 rupees which is being lent, अगर 100 रुपए lent हो रहे हैं rural areas में, about 30 rupees which is being lent is still through non-institutional source. Non-institutional source मतलब जैसे जमींदार, money lender, patidar, all these people who lend people, local money lender who lend money to people, and this money is lent at a very high rate of interest, under very difficult conditions which are difficult to fulfill, conditions which are meant, for example, so the conditions which are such that you will be in bonded labor throughout your life. Your generations would be in bonded labor if you are unable to pay the money back, and usually what happens is many people are not able to pay the money back, and hence their families, their generations end up as being bonded labor. So share of institutional credit has increased, share of non-institutional credit has decreased, but still it's quite big. This begs financial inclusion. This I've drawn this graph first before I explain financial inclusion because this begs that there must be something called financial inclusion. Financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is, now let me tell you what the 4 pillars of financial inclusion are. The 4 pillars of financial inclusion are that first, you are part of the formal financial system. The formal financial system recognizes your presence. You are part of the formal financial system. मतलब क्या है? That you have a bank account somewhere. You are part of the system. If you are not part of the system, you will not be able to avail services offered by the system. So first requirement for financial inclusion is that you are part of the formal financial system. You have a bank account somewhere. That is the first part. But merely having a bank account does not guarantee or does not mean that you are financially included. If you have account in a bank, but the bank is located far away, only once a month does one representative of the bank comes to you, and from that representative you can make a withdrawal or you can deposit money through that representative. You cannot go and avail services in the bank. It's as good as non-existence. I mean, better than before, but certainly not very better, not too much better. So part of the financial system means that you are not just having a bank account, but at the same time you have access to that bank account. Access to that bank account. Being part of a formal financial system doesn't mean that you are just one data point. कि आप केवल एक अकाउंट नंबर की तरह एग्जिस्ट कर रहे हो. That doesn't mean. Part of formal financial system doesn't mean that you are merely one bank account in the eyes of the bank. Part of formal financial system means that you have a bank account and you have access, easy access to that bank account. Easy access to that bank account. Next, the next pillar is availability of choice. The second pillar of financial inclusion is availability of choice. What is meant by this term, availability of choice? Merely having a bank account and having access to your bank account doesn't mean financial inclusion. केवल बैंक अकाउंट होना या फिर बैंक पास में होना, that doesn't mean financial inclusion. Bank is there in your vicinity or in your village, or let's say in a cluster of villages there is one bank, easily accessible, quite accessible. But the bank is not offering too many services. बैंक केवल एक सर्विस ऑफर करता है, that you come to us and deposit your money, nothing else. Bank offers, let's say SBI has a branch in a particular village, but in that branch SBI only accepts deposits. SBI says that from this branch we will not give loan. लोन का डिसीजन है वो डिस्ट्रिक्ट के हेडक्वार्टर पे जो ब्रांच है वहां पे होगा. लोन का डिसीजन इस ब्रांच में नहीं हो सकता है. SBI लोन देता है, लेकिन लोन के लिए आपको वहां जाना पड़ेगा. You'll have to go and take loan from that district headquarter branch. This branch is only meant as a, think of it as an extension counter where you can come and deposit your money and withdraw money. Nothing more than that. Absence of choice. Absence of choice. Bank is there, but bank is not giving you any choice. You can only come and deposit money here in your account. Deposit account is only of one type. You'll not be able to open FD or RD here. You'll not be able to get loans of different maturity. You'll not be able to get any debit card, credit card here. It is only one choice that is given to you. That means no choice. केवल एक ही चीज है जो आप कर सकते हो. Apply this in urban areas, for example. I go to a bank. I will want to have multiple options available in front of me. कि भाई मुझे किस टाइप का बैंक अकाउंट खुलवाना है. गो टू योर बैंक अकाउंट्स वेबसाइट. आईसीआईसीआई बैंक की वेबसाइट पे जाओ, एक्सिस बैंक की वेबसाइट पे जाओ, एचडीएफसी पे जाओ. 20 अलग अलग तरीके के कार्ड्स हैं जो ऑफर किए जा रहे हैं. 20 डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ कार्ड्स. योर सैलरी अकाउंट, अलग अलग टाइप के सैलरी अकाउंट हैं, बिजनेस अकाउंट. डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ प्रोडक्ट्स आर मेड अवेलेबल टू यू. That is what choice is. Availability of choice. You must have a choice depending upon what do you want. It must not be the case that you are forced to exercise only one option which is given to you. There is no option. There is only one thing. If you have to avail banking services, तो केवल इसी तरीके से avail कर सकते हो. There is no choice. If there is no choice, then many people would be reluctant to enter these financial services or not, to become reluctant to become part of formal financial system or not. अगर choice ही नहीं है, if a person doesn't have any choice, तो आपको मैं बोलूंगा आप उस बैंक में चले जाओ, लेकिन वहां पे आपको केवल यही सुविधा मिलेगी, आपका सारा पैसा तो वहां पे चला गया, और all money has gone there, you will not be able to withdraw anything, you will not get loan from anywhere. So availability of choice is the next pillar of financial inclusion. The third pillar of financial inclusion is that the choice must be exercisable at an affordable cost and a requisite time. If I want to borrow money, if I want a loan from the bank, I must be given an option. I must be given set of options that you want 1 lakh rupees. आप 1 लाख रुपए को 1 साल में लौटा सकते हो, 2 में लौटा सकते हो, 5 में लौटा सकते हो, and depending upon whatever your tenure is, we will pay you, we will charge different rates of interest from you. Choice, 3 अलग-अलग choice दी आपको. Next, they say that if you keep something as a security, then the rate of interest will come down by 3 percentage point. Fourth choice. So 3 different रीपेमेंट टेन्योर्स उन्होंने आपको दिए, 1 साल में वापस करना है, 2 में वापस करना है, 5 में वापस करना है. 3 different tenures. Second, they said over and above this, if you give us, if you say that you will provide security of your, you will give some sort of security in form of your land, then interest rate will be reduced by 2 percentage points. Fourth choice आपको दी. These choices must be such that they are exercisable by you. These choices must be such that they must be exercisable at an affordable cost and at a requisite time. You will be given a loan, but loan will be given at the rate of 20%. अब मैं बैंक से 20% पे लोन लूं और एक लोकल मनी लेंडर से 30% पे लूं, क्या फर्क पड़ता है? लोकल मनी लेंडर को मैं बोल दूंगा भाई साहब इस महीने पैसे नहीं दे पा रहा हूं, तो कुछ कहेगा नहीं. बैंक को बोलूंगा पैसे नहीं दे पा रहा हूं, तो बैंक वाले केस कर सकते हैं मेरे ऊपर. बैंक विल बी मोर स्ट्रिक्ट इन डीलिंग विद मी, द लोकल मनी लेंडर वुड बी लेस स्ट्रिक्ट. Bank will ask for 10 different documents from me if bank has to lend money to me. Local money lender, he knows me very well. He'll not ask for any kind of document. He'll straight away give loan to me. His intentions might be bad, but I'll have to go through very less hassles if I have to take money from him. Money is available from the bank, but is it available at an affordable cost? Choice is exercisable. Choice is available, but it must be exercisable at a cost which is affordable to me. I should get loan, but बैंक कह रहा है हम आपको लोन तो दे रहे हैं, बट वी विल गिव लोन टू यू एट अ वेरी हाई रेट. डजंट मेक सेंस, डजंट मेक यू फाइनेंशियली इंक्लूडेड. और वी आर गिविंग लोन टू यू, बट वी विल गिव लोन टू यू ओनली व्हेन यू फुलफिल ऑल दीज कंडीशंस, एंड दिस फुलफिलमेंट ऑफ कंडीशंस विल टेक 1 year ऑफ टाइम. आपको इस साल की फसल के लिए लोन चाहिए और बैंक बोल रहा है अगले साल लोन देंगे. सो एट रिक्विजिट टाइम एंड एट एन अफोर्डेबल कॉस्ट. Choices must be exercisable at affordable cost and at a requisite time. Third important pillar of financial inclusion. And the fourth pillar is ability to make a choice, that is financial education or financial literacy. You must be able to decide that which is the best option for you. Should you get loan for 1 year tenure, 2 year tenure, 3 year tenure? Should you put your land as a security? What should be the best option for you? This must be decided by yourself. You must have the ability to make a choice. These 4 pillars together form what is called as financial inclusion. ये चारों मिलके बनाते हैं what is called as a financially inclusive society. So this is what is meant by the term financial inclusion. Now, we'll talk about financial inclusion with help of 2 examples. We'll talk about financial inclusion with help of priority sector lending and with the help of bank nationalization. तो मैंने कहा था पहले PSL करेंगे, but let's do bank nationalization first. Bank nationalization. तो पहले इसको कर लेते हैं, and from that we will try to analyze financial inclusion. Bank nationalization process. Before independence, banks were private. Banks in rest of the world, everywhere banks are private. ठीक है, इंडिया में सरकारी बैंक है. Rest मतलब socialist countries which are socialist hangover, these have private banks. Rest of the world banks are private. Anyways, how has banking emerged? Last class में we talked about how has banking emerged. Banking emerged as when I was a money lender and I decided to formalize my operation, and therefore I decided to register myself as a bank. This is how bank emerged. So banks in pre-independence era were all private. सारे private बैंक हुआ करते थे. After independence, the process of nationalization starts. Now, what is this process of nationalization? Process of nationalization is government taking over bank, government purchasing the bank from its erstwhile owner. तो जो भी owner होगा, the person who had started that bank, government will purchase the bank from that owner. If he is living, then from that person or whoever the current owner is. That is what nationalization is. Nationalization involves one very important aspect: government buying bank from the owner. This buying by government is most of the times forceful. Government buy to karegi as in government will buy and therefore government will pay to the owner, but most of the times this buying is forceful. Government will purchase an asset from you but will probably not compensate you fairly for that. सरकार बोलेगी आपका ये asset है, ये हम खरीद रहे हैं, इसके लिए आपको इतने पैसे देते हैं. Usually government will not compensate you fairly for that. So this is exactly what happened in bank nationalization. Government purchased banks, but certainly it is argued that government did not pay the owners fairly. Anyways, so government took over the bank. सरकार ने banks खरीद लिए. First bank to be nationalized was Imperial Bank. Imperial Bank, which we now know as SBI, State Bank of India, 1956. 1956 में first bank this was nationalized. Imperial Bank, which became State Bank of India. Question has been asked in prelims. Question पूछा गया था, arrange the following in the order of chronology. सबसे पहले क्या हुआ, सबसे बाद में क्या हुआ. Arrange the following in the order of chronology, and one option there was nationalization of SBI, another option was Banking Regulation Act, and other options with this. I don't remember the other two options, but this option was there: nationalization of Imperial Bank of India. Imperial Bank of India was nationalized in 1956 and became SBI, State Bank of India. So this was first nationalization. सरकार ने सबसे पहले इस बैंक को nationalize किया. Then in 1969 and 70, in 1969-70, government nationalized 10 more banks. 10 more banks were nationalized. 1970 में 10 और banks nationalized किए गए थे. For example, Punjab National Bank, Canara Bank, Oriental Bank of Commerce. All these banks were nationalized in 1970. Bank of Baroda, Allahabad Bank, all these banks were nationalized in 1970. This is what is primarily known as bank nationalization. क्योंकि यहाँ पे तो सरकार ने, this is just one bank that was purchased by the government, and then in this year, this was just one instance. Government nationalized a bank, as in government's argument was that we need a national bank so that we can push our agenda of financial inclusion. In 1970, government said that we are unable to push our agenda of financial inclusion, therefore we need to nationalize more banks. So therefore government forcefully nationalized 10 more banks. 10 banks और nationalize कर दी सरकार ने in 1970. In 1979, 10 साल के बाद government nationalized 9 more banks. 9 banks और nationalize किए सरकार ने. 1979-1980 में government nationalized 9 more banks, and that was it. That was the last phase of nationalization. उसके बाद सरकार ने nationalize नहीं किया. Some banks, 1 or 2 banks have been nationalized even after that, but then this was 1979 में एकदम से आपने 9 banks और nationalize कर दी, but after this nationalization stopped for good. 1 or 2 banks were purchased by the government even after that, but that is okay. जैसे this is not called as nationalization of banks. एक बैंक है वो खरीदा, इसके बाद भी 1-2 बैंक, मर्केंटाइल बैंक वगैरह सरकार ने कुछ खरीदे थे, कुछ बैंक, छोटे छोटे बैंक, वेरी स्मॉल बैंक्स गवर्नमेंट परचेज, बट दैट इज नॉट टर्म्ड एज नेशनलाइजेशन. नेशनलाइजेशन हम जब whenever you use the word nationalization, we refer to these two phases, 1969-70 and 1979-80. These are two phases of bank nationalization. Bank nationalization was undertaken by the government in order to further the objective of financial inclusion. Banks before that were primarily located in urban areas, number one. Number two, in urban areas, banks used to lend only to few customers. Banking services were not available to most of the people. Most of the country was deprived of banking services. Banks were available in only urban areas, and in urban areas, banking services were made available only to few people, not to large number of people. Banking services are required by people. Why? Because if I'm a small business, I would want a loan to expand or start my business. I would want a loan. And if I am deprived a loan, I am denied a loan by the bank, then For me, existence of banks is immaterial. I would want a loan, I would want a safe place to deposit my money. I need to avail banking services, and if banking services are not available to me, then banking system is no good for me. So with this objective, government nationalized the banks in our country. Most of the banks which were private banks were nationalized. Some banks still remained, continued to function as private banks, but then over a period of time, government nationalized all the banking sector. Then after that, जब उसके बाद कोई private bank नहीं बचा, when no private bank was left, then wave of private banks started. I'll repeat. Nationalization हुआ 1991 तक, nationalization छोटा छोटा थोड़ा बहुत चलता रहा, and after that no more nationalization. After 1991, economy was opened up, and when economy was opened up, banking was amongst one of those sectors which were earlier also open for private sector and now even more open for private sector. I'll repeat. Banking एक ऐसा sector था जो पहले से private sector के लिए open था. Why? Because banks were private. जो nationalize हुए वो सारे banks private ही तो थे. So banking was one of those sectors which was already open for private sector. But post 1991, banking became an attractive sector. Why? Because government's control over the economy, it reduced, reform process started post 1991, and therefore need for banking services increased. When need for banking services increased, then private sector also started to come in this space. पहले प्राइवेट सेक्टर वाज वेरी रिलक्टेंट, क्योंकि जितने भी प्राइवेट बैंक थे वो सारे नेशनलाइज होते जा रहे थे. बट नाउ पोस्ट 1991 प्राइवेट सेक्टर स्टार्टेड टू कम इनटू दिस स्पेस. बिग बैंक्स लाइक, I mean, initially they were quite small. ICICI Bank was set up, then HDFC Bank was set up. UTI Bank हुआ करता था. UTI Bank was then merged with Axis Bank. So Axis Bank was set up earlier, and then UTI Bank was sold to Axis Bank. So there was, yes, now there are so many private sector banks, RBL banks, AU Small Finance Bank. There are many private sector banks today. Kotak Bank came in early 2000s. Yes Bank came in, I think, about 2005 or 2006. So all these were banks. So post 1991, there was a wave of private banks coming into the banking space. Bank nationalization was done with the objective of financial inclusion. Now, did bank nationalization achieve the objective of financial inclusion? क्या bank nationalization की वजह से was the objective of financial inclusion achieved? Now think about it. If I come back to this graph, then you see that in 1970s the pace picks up. In 1980s the pace picks up even more. In 2000s it stabilizes. It's still increasing, but it's increasing at a lower pace now. If we look at this graph, which shows us share of institutional credit in total rural lending, then 1970s में ऐसा क्या हुआ था that this started to increase? Obviously, bank nationalization happened here. Bank nationalization. So as far as share in rural credit is concerned, bank nationalization did lead to increase in financial inclusion. It did lead to. But थोड़ा सा इसको critically analyze करते हैं. Let's try to critically analyze bank nationalization and financial inclusion. Now this is something important. In 1970, when 10 banks were nationalized, 1970 में when these banks were nationalized, about 3 to 4%, लगभग 3 से 4%, about 3, please listen carefully everybody, about 3 to 4% of households in the country had access to banking services. Listen carefully everyone, I will repeat. In 1969-70, when banks were nationalized, out of the total households in the country, about 3 to 4% or 4 to 5% of the households in the country had access to banking services. As in, they had a bank account, they were able to exercise, they were able to avail banking services. लगभग 3 से 4% लोग ऐसे थे, households ऐसे थे. 40 years after bank nationalization, इन अबाउट 2007, 2007 की बात है, इन अबाउट 2007, लिसन केयरफुली, 40 years आफ्टर बैंक नेशनलाइजेशन, 1969-70 में हमने किया, और 2007 में लगभग 37 years, so 40 years after, or let's say to be precise 37 years after bank nationalization, percentage of households which had access to banking services who had a bank account, households who had a bank account had increased from that 4 to 5% to merely about 12%, लगभग 12%. Only 12% population, only 12% of households की बात है यहां पे, households, it's not population की बात करेंगे तो डिवाइड बाय 5 कर लो, क्योंकि एक हाउसहोल्ड का साइज 5 है. यूजुअली इन वन हाउसहोल्ड ओनली 1 person will have a bank account. Households wise, only 12% of population had bank accounts. Even in 2007, 2007 में, even in 2007, only 12% of population had 12% of households had bank account. So assuming, let's say, okay, one household, one bank account is sufficient. So only 12% of households had access to banking services via a formal bank account. गवर्नमेंट रिकॉग्नाइज, सरकार ने रिकॉग्नाइज किया. 2005 में गवर्नमेंट की स्कीम भी लेके आई जिसके अंदर जीरो बैलेंस अकाउंट, यू माइट हैव हर्ड अबाउट इट, जीरो बैलेंस अकाउंट. गवर्नमेंट पुश्ड द बैंक्स टू ओपन बैंक अकाउंट्स ऑफ द पॉपुलेशन, said that minimum balance requirement is zero. You can maintain zero balance in your account and still your account will be opened. So government pushed some sort of financial inclusion in 2005 with various schemes, and despite that only 12% of population in 2007 had access to bank accounts. By 2011, 2011 तक, by 2011 this percentage population increased to somewhere around 20%, 20% के आसपास हो गई थी. 20% of households in the country had 20% of households in the country had bank accounts by 2011, 2011 तक. Think about it, 1969 में आपने नेशनलाइज किया था जब 3-4% लोगों के पास बैंक अकाउंट था, और 2011 तक 40 years, more than 40 years have passed, and only 20% of households have access to formal financial services, as in are part of formal financial system. Utter failure of bank nationalization, कि आपका जो ऑब्जेक्टिव था, utter failure, complete failure. In 2011, government came up with more schemes, जैसे वो area based scheme आई, lead bank scheme. This scheme came that how to improve financial inclusion. Government came up with schemes through which government tried to set up banks in unbanked areas, कि जहां पे भी in plain areas wherever population is above 5,000, there must be one bank within 1 kilometer radius. In hilly areas wherever population is 2,000, there must be one bank within 1 kilometer radius. So government came up with such schemes. By 2014, 2014 तक, by 2014, 2014 तक, this number 20%, this had increased to somewhere around 30%, लगभग 30%, 30-35%, this was the number. 30-35 is a big range, I understand that. But by 2014, this number had increased to merely 30-35% of population. 2015, 2015 में स्कीम स्टार्ट हुई, जनधन योजना. मोदी जी ने अनाउंस की जनधन योजना, स्कीम वाज अनाउंस्ड इन 2015. When Jandan Yojana was announced, जब जनधन योजना अनाउंस हुई थी, at that time it was estimated that about 40% of households in the country, 40% of households, population नहीं, population के लिए divide कर लो 5 से, 40% of house, that means 8% of population on an average, may have been more than that, certainly yes, but 40% of households had bank account. Jandan Yojana came in 2015. This has been the biggest financial inclusion story in the entire world. कहीं पे भी biggest story financial inclusion की. Came in 2015. By 2017, जनधन योजना when it came, it had 2 phases. 2 phase में scheme implement होनी थी. First phase for 2 years, next phase for 5 years. 2017 तक पहला phase था, 2017 के बाद दूसरा phase था. So in the first phase, focus on जनधन योजना was this. First part of formal financial system. First you have to open bank accounts, only then people can become part of formal financial system. So focus of Jandan Yojana in the first phase was opening up of bank accounts. By 2017, 2017 tak, by 2017, more than 90% of households had bank accounts. Tremendous. Imagine the scale of achievement. More than 90% of households. Today, 100% of households, सरकार बोलती है 100%, but there would be many who still don't have. So let's say 99%, almost complete. Today, almost every household has access to banking services. Today, almost every household has a bank account. Almost every household in the country today has a bank account. That has been the achievement of Jan Dhan Yojana. It is estimated that about 80% of population, लगभग 80%, बहुत यहाँ पे मैंने लिख दिया है, but you are also listening to what I am speaking. 80% of population today has bank accounts. 80% of population. Now that has been a tremendous achievement as far as financial inclusion is concerned. First step, that you have to bring people to be part of the formal financial system. As far as this is concerned, now we are almost at that stage that everybody in the country has now a bank account, or at least every household in the country now has a bank account. Almost 80% of population now has a bank account. So bank nationalization was not able to achieve its objective of financial inclusion. Not in even wildest of dreams, bank nationalization was not able to achieve its objective. There is an argument that Jan Dhan Yojana was implemented or could be implemented, the success of Jan Dhan Yojana as in almost 100% of households, this success could not have been achieved had there not been public sector banks. Certainly ये argument दिया जा सकता है, but फिर तो यही बात होगी, that means अगर public sector banks होने की वजह से ही Jan Dhan Yojana has been able to achieve this, then why it could not have been achieved earlier? So obviously that's a having public sector banks certainly propelled the implementation of scheme, no doubt about that, but it was not because of existence of public sector banks. Public sector banks, having them, it propelled the pace at which the scheme was implemented. Not just public sector banks, private sector banks had to participated by, in a way, जितने भी नए banks खुले उसके अंदर जितने भी नए accounts खुले, if you look at the new accounts opened in Jan Dhan Yojana, then if we look at market share of public sector banks and market share of private sector banks, almost 75% share जो है public sector banks का है banking space, banking sector के अंदर, 25% share private sector banks का है. The new accounts opened under Jan Dhan Yojana, the share is almost the same. About 75% of accounts were opened under public sector banks, 25% accounts were opened under private sector banks. So share is almost the same. So ऐसा नहीं है that it is only because of public sector banks. Yes, having public sector banks certainly propelled implementation of the scheme to by very fast pace, but that is not the only reason. So this is about bank nationalization. Government nationalized the banks with the objective of financial inclusion. However, financial inclusion could not be achieved as most of the population was still out of the formal financial system even 50 years after, almost 50 years after bank, not 50 years तो 2020 में हो गए, almost 40 years after bank nationalization, only 12% of population had, 12% of households had access to formal financial system. After that, through various government efforts, now especially after Jan Dhan Yojana, now the coverage is almost 100%. More than 99% of households today have access to banking services, have bank accounts. In phase 2 of Jan Dhan Yojana, the next available objectives of financial inclusion were to be met, as in providing various products so that choices can be made, and at the same time financial literacy or financial education. These were also the objectives of Jan Dhan Yojana, which were part of phase 2. So as we have seen, for example, during COVID, due to existence of Jan Dhan accounts, government has been able to transfer subsidy, transfer money, transfer payments into the accounts of so many households directly. So Jan Dhan Yojana has been one of the biggest achievements of the present government, biggest achievement, because through this it has achieved what could not have been achieved, what was not achieved in earlier years. This has been one of the biggest achievements or biggest positive points in economy, in the financial domain of the present government, through which financial inclusion has been ushered. Financial inclusion has been ushered in. So this was about financial inclusion with respect to bank nationalization. नाउ लेट्स टॉक अबाउट प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग, पीएसएल की बात करते हैं. अरे बातें मत करो यहां पे, गप्पे मत मारो. अभी टॉक अबाउट, अभी लिसन टू मी, अभी आपस में बात मत करो. पीपल आर इंडल्ज इन प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स, पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स. प्लीज पॉलिटिकल डिस्कशंस मत करना. प्लीज डोंट डू एनी पॉलिटिकल डिस्कशंस, है ना. पॉलिटिकल डिस्कशंस, आई हैव टोल्ड अर्लियर आल्सो, पॉलिटिकल डिस्कशंस आर एंडलेस. फैक्ट्स के ऊपर बात करेंगे और किसी चीज की बात नहीं करेंगे. लेट्स टॉक अबाउट पीएसएल नाउ, प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग. Priority sector lending, PSL, is one of the ways through which financial inclusion is achieved. I'll repeat, priority sector lending is one of the ways through which financial inclusion is achieved. What is priority sector lending? PSL क्या है? PSL is a directive. PSL, प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग, पीएसएल. पीएसएल क्या है? पीएसएल इज अ डायरेक्टिव टू बैंक्स. इट्स अ डायरेक्टिव टू बैंक्स टू लेंड. लिसन केयरफुली एवरीबॉडी. पीएसएल इज अ डायरेक्टिव टू बैंक्स टू लेंड a certain percentage of their ANBC. I'll tell you what ANBC is. Certain percentage of their ANBC to specific sectors called priority sector. This specific percentage or the certain percentage is 40%. PSL is a directive to banks to lend 40% of their ANBC to specific sectors which are called priority sector. What is ANBC? ANBC is aggregate net bank credit. Aggregate net bank credit, that is what ANBC is. सिंपल टर्म में समझो कि अगर बैंक ने 100 रुपए उधार दिए हैं, if bank has lent 100 rupees, सिंपल टर्म में समझेंगे, if the bank has lent 100 rupees, then out of those 100 rupees 40 rupees have to be lent to specific sectors called priority sectors. 40 रुपए प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर में लेंड करने हैं. If banks have lent in a total 100 rupees, 40 must be lent to priority sector. Certain specific sector की एक list है. There is a list of those sectors that what would be called a priority sector. There is a, I have not said agriculture, I have not used the word agriculture. I have simply said that there is a specific list of sectors. Banks have to lend 40% of their total credit. Think about it as total credit. ANBC, aggregate net bank credit. Of the total amount of money that banks have lent, 40% of that must be lent to specific sectors which are called priority sectors. PSL is a guideline, is a directive of RBI. PSL is a directive of RBI, not Government of India. There is no direction from Government of India. There is no rule, there is no law that Government of India has made. It is part of a regulatory directive. It is a regulatory measure by RBI. RBI ने एक रेगुलेशन के तौर पे डायरेक्टिव दिया है that 40% of a bank's ANBC must be lent to certain specific sectors which are called priority sector. It is RBI's directive, not government's. It is RBI's directive. This list of specific sectors, this list keeps on getting updated. New sectors keep on getting added. Government will ask RBI कि भाई इसको भी add कर दो, इसको भी add कर दो. So government and RBI together may take a decision based on this. Ultimately decision is of RBI, but government may ask RBI कि please add this sector as well. This list is dynamic in nature. Sectors keep on getting added. Whatever sector government feels needs more credit, that sector may be added as part of priority sector list. Earlier, this sector, this list consisted mostly of agriculture. पहले इसके अंदर था agriculture sector था, which was the biggest part. Still it is there. There was, let's say, student loans or education sector, student loans, That is one part of priority sector list. There is loans to MSMEs, micro, small, medium enterprises. Now, loans to renewable energy enterprises, they have been added. Renewable energy enterprises, they have been added, etc. और भी कई सारी चीजें हैं. There are few loans. Infrastructure sector, some part of infrastructure has been made part of, some part, not completely, some part has been made, some specific part has been made of priority sector lending. So point is, there is a list of sectors, loans to which will be classified as priority sector. समझते हैं क्या है priority sector lending. बैंक के पास total 50 rupees. Bank has, think, listen everyone. Bank has 100 rupees of deposits. 100 rupees of deposits. Bank has 100 rupees of deposits. Out of these 100 rupees of deposits, let's say 4 rupees, 4% is CRR, 4% हो गई CRR. Out of this 100 rupees deposit, 20% is your, or 20 rupees is your SLR. 4 rupees you have to keep with RBI in form of CRR. 20 rupees you have to keep in form of statutory liquid assets. 76 rupees is lendable deposits. इस 76 रुपए क्या है? Lendable deposits. 76 rupees are lendable deposits. Next, bank lends. बैंक ने lend किया है. Bank lends a total of 200 rupees. 200 रुपए बैंक ने lend कर दिए. How much money does bank have in form of lendable deposits? 76 rupees बैंक के पास lendable deposits हैं. Remaining 124 rupees बैंक के पास कहां से आए? Bank may have borrowed from another bank. Bank may have borrowed from public. Bank may have borrowed money from RBI. Remaining 124 can come from anywhere. The owners of bank, they might have put their own money. कुछ भी, कहीं से भी, कैसे भी, कोई भी पैसा सर बैंक के पास आया है. Total lending by bank is how much? 200. हमने डिस्कस किया था in our money creation process that deposits and loans, these are independent of each other. Demand for deposit, demand for loans and the amount of deposits independent of each other. So 76 rupees is lendable deposit and 200 rupees is actual amount of loan. I've exaggerated it. बहुत ज्यादा exaggerate किया है. Obviously इतना difference नहीं होगा. I've exaggerated it so that you understand, you get the point that these two are independent of each other. Out of the 200 rupees that bank has lent, जितने बैंक ने उधार दिए, बैंक ने लोन दिया है, out of 200 rupees that bank has lent, 40%, that is 80 rupees, would be given to priority sector, would be given in priority sector. Out of 200 rupees that bank lends, 80 rupees would be given to priority sector. Remaining 120 rupees can be lent according to bank's wishes, according to bank's wishes, bank's choices. 80 rupees must be given to priority sector. That means अगर आपने 200 रुपए का लोन दिया है, the total amount of loan that you have given, 80 rupees of loan must be in private sector. For example, let's assume for a moment, assume कर लेते हैं that priority sector means agriculture, means rural credit. Rural credit is not agriculture. Rural credit किसी भी पर्पस के लिए लिया जा सकता है. Agriculture is specifically for agriculture. So let's say 80 rupees is for rural, is rural credit. Rural area में 80 rupees lend किए गए हैं. So banks will have to lend out of the 200 rupees that they are lending. Total lending 200 रुपए की कर रहे हैं. Out of 200 rupees, 80 rupees must be lent by them in rural areas. If priority sector is only, let's say, rural areas, केवल rural area का credit priority sector है. So 80 rupees must be lent essentially by them only in rural areas. Out of this 120 rupees, इसमें से भी if they want, if they are seeing okay, rural areas are performing good, they are giving high rate of interest and they are not defaulting on their loans, why not? They can give more money to rural areas, but chances are they will not. So this is what priority sector is. Priority sector lending. banks are mandated, banks are required by RBI. Under RBI's directions, banks are required that they will have to lend 40% of their ANBC as part of priority sector lending. This is one of the ways of qualitative controls, qualitative tools of money supply, qualitative tools of money supply. One of the ways through which RBI conducts monetary policy in a qualitative way. I asked you to read monetary policies qualitative tools on your own. Qualitative tools के अंदर one of the ways is selective credit control. Selective credit control. Selective credit control. Selective credit control क्या है? RBI will ask the banks that you should lend to these sectors. You should avoid lending to this particular sector. RBI will say that it is COVID times. During COVID times, avoid lending to tourism sector. Selective credit control. RBI is giving some kind of direction to bank that you don't lend to this particular sector, or RBI will say this is COVID time, please lend to health sector, that health is a priority here, so please lend to that sector. Selective credit control. One of the control which is permanent here is that RBI has asked banks that 40% of their aggregate net bank credit, that is the total amount of lending that they do, must be given to priority sector. Examples of sectors which are part of priority sector, this can be asked in prelims. Prelims में ये पूछा जा सकता है question, which of the following is part of priority sector lending? This can be asked. इनमें से कौन सा priority sector lending का part है, कौन सा priority नहीं है? This is a viable question that may be asked in prelims. Please अपने material से देखना. I don't remember the entire list. वो list काफी बड़ी है, मतलब 8-10 sectors हैं उसके अंदर, but have a look at it so that you are able to recognize कि कौन सा नहीं है. Agriculture is one of the biggest part of priority sector lending. In fact, within 40% of target of priority sector, जो 40% priority sector का target है, within this 40% there is a sub target. There is a sub target of 18% for agriculture. इसमें एक सब टारगेट है that out of this 40%, 18% must be given to agriculture. ये एग्रीकल्चर का भी एक सब टारगेट दे रखा है. इसमें भी एक सब टारगेट है that out of this 18%, 10% must be given to small and marginal farmers. इसमें भी एक सब टारगेट है. Again, you don't need to remember these targets. 18% for agriculture, 10% for small and marginal. You don't need to remember. Don't waste your precious neurons. I'm just telling you that selective credit controls can be exercised by RBI in such ways. So RBI says, number one, what have we learned? RBI says that 40% of banks A and BC must be lent to priority sector. Total lending में से 40% priority sector को lend करना है. What is priority sector? It is simply a list. एक list है जो update होती रहती है. Said right now, last year I think government updated that some sectors like renewable energy, some infrastructure projects, they have also been made eligible for lending under priority sector. कि मतलब now when bank gives loans to some project which is in renewable energy, bank give loans to some project which is in renewable energy, now bank can count that loan as part of priority sector lending. Bank has given some loan to farmer, bank will obviously count that loan as part of priority sector lending. Bank has given loan to some MSME, micro small medium enterprise, bank will count that loan as part of its priority sector lending कि 80 रुपए पूरे हो रहे हैं कि नहीं. These 80 rupees out of 200 total lending are these 8. By 10 rupees we have given to farmer 1, 15 rupees we have given to farmer 2, 20 rupees we have given to a renewable energy project 1. So bank will count all these lendings as part of its commitments to priority sector. I'll repeat, bank will count all these lendings which the bank is doing as part of its commitments, as part of its requirement to meet priority sector targets. Bank has sub targets within this priority sector. That means 18% agriculture को ही दिया जाना है और उस 18% में से 10% small and marginal farmer को ही दिया जाना है. So there are sub targets also within this priority sector lending targets given to banks by RBI. I hope this is clear. Priority sector क्या है? Now, priority sector में और भी हमें पढ़ना है. PSL, priority sector lending. We have understood what priority sector lending is, that 40% of ANBC, aggregate net bank credit, to be given to priority sector, bank will give loans and out of those loans bank has to ensure कि total amount का loan जो दिया है उसमें से 40% total amount, not 200 loans, 200 rupees worth of loans. बैंक ने 100 लोन दिए हैं, 100 different people have borrowed money from the bank. Doesn't mean that bank has to give, out of those 100 different people, bank has to give loan to 40 different people. ये statements होती हैं जो एग्जाम में कंफ्यूज करती हैं. These are the statements that will be there in the exam which are going to confuse you. 40% of total credit value कितनी है उसका 40%. So 40% of A and BC has to be given to priority sector, PSL. Now banks, meaning all banks have to comply with PSL norms. All banks have to comply with PSL norm. Each and every bank in the country has to comply with PSL norm. कोई भी बैंक हो, any bank has to comply with PSL norms. डोमेस्टिक बैंक हो, फॉरेन बैंक हो, सिटी बैंक को इंडिया में काम करना है, सिटी बैंक ऑल्सो हैज टू कंप्लाई विद प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग नॉर्म्स. एनी बैंक इन द कंट्री हैज टू कंप्लाई विद पीएसएल नॉर्म्स. एनी बैंक. देयर इज सम रिलैक्सेशन गिवन टू फॉरेन बैंक्स विच हैव लेस देन 20 ब्रांचेस, जिनकी इंडिया में 20 से कम ब्रांचेस हैं. देयर इज सम रिलैक्सेशन गिवन टू फॉरेन बैंक्स which have less than 20 branches. That relaxation is given to them, but that is not a special relaxation. That relaxation is available to other banks as well. वो क्या है? Let's see. As I said, all banks have to comply with priority sector lending norms. Every bank will have to comply. Now, it might be a case that some banks may be unable to comply with PSL targets. For example, take a bank which is primarily operational in urban areas. Now that bank will find it difficult to lend 40% of its total credit to priority sector. Banks may find, भाई this is a, ये आपने requirement तो बोल दी banks को, CRR was to be set aside from your deposits. There is nothing that has to be done here. It is automatic. Whatever deposit you get, you will have to set aside 4% from this. SLR, whatever deposits you get, 20% उन डिपॉजिट से आपको गवर्नमेंट बॉन्ड्स खरीदने, स्टैट्यूटरी लिक्विड एसेट्स खरीदने ही खरीदने. देयर इज नथिंग that has to happen which is not in your control. That is nothing. Everything is in your control here. But think about priority sector lending. In priority sector lending, it also depends upon banks' ability to lend. It also depends upon, for example, demand for credit from rural areas. अब ऐसा तो नहीं है कि बैंक 40% का टारगेट पूरा करने के लिए, in order to fulfill its targets of 40%, it's not the case that bank will simply lend money to anybody. कोई बैंक को टारगेट पूरा नहीं हो रहा है कि 80 rupees had to be lent. Continuing with our example, 80 rupees had to be lent to priority sector. Bank is not able to meet its target. बैंक will ऐसा तो नहीं करेगा ना, बैंक की किसी को भी जाके पैसा दे देगा. That is as good as a loss for the bank. Bank will evaluate, like any other loan, bank will also evaluate that whether giving money to this particular person, which is part of priority sector lending, does it make sense or not? Will bank not evaluate or not? Obviously, bank will not simply throw away money that we have a requirement that we have to lend 80 rupees. Therefore, let's बांट देते हैं पैसा and let everybody run away with this money. Obviously, it is mine and your money. Why would bank do that? So, if bank is required to lend these 80 rupees, this requirement the fulfillment of this requirement is contingent upon many external factors. I'll repeat, it is a requirement that bank has to lend these 80 rupees. Fulfillment of this requirement is contingent upon many external matlab factors which are not exactly in the hands of bank. Bank will not lend this money just like it. Bank will have to assess what is the risk profile of the person. Bank will have to assess whether there must be a credit demand for this particular sector or the sector which are part of priority sector. Only then bank will be able to lend. Otherwise, bank will not be able to lend. So there would be many instances when a bank may not be able to comply with the targets. I'll repeat, there would be many instances where a bank may not be able to comply with the targets of priority sector lending. Now, if bank is unable to comply with targets of priority sector lending, जैसे हमने देखा था MSF में marginal standing facility में क्या था? You have to pay a penal rate of interest, 1% extra. You can draw down on your government security requirement from SLR, but if you use them to borrow from RBI, you will have to pay 1% extra. So penalty लगती थी आपको उसके अंदर. यहां पे as such कोई penalty नहीं लगती है. Here there is no penalty which banks have to bear if they are unable to lend their required amount to priority sector. There is no penalty that RBI will levy. But the shortfalls which the banks have, bank may be unable to comply with priority sector lending target. If there is a shortfall, then there has to be shortfall has to be made up. Shortfall has to be made up. I'll tell you how it is made up. If a bank is unable to lend these 80 rupees, continuing with the example, 80 rupees, 40% of 200 rupees, the total lending by bank. If bank is unable to lend these 80 rupees to priority sector, that means there is a shortfall. मान लो bank was able to lend only 60 rupees. 60 rupees bank ने lend की. So there is a shortfall of 20 rupees. 20 रुपए की shortfall है. There is a shortfall of 20 rupees. If there is a shortfall, this shortfall has to be made up. ये 20 रुपए जो shortfall हुए हैं, this has to be made up. How has this to be made up? ये कैसे made up की जाएगी? This shortfall is made up using two options available. There are two options available with the banks to make up for this shortfall. I'll repeat. Please understand कि हम क्या पढ़ रहे हैं? हम पढ़ रहे हैं priority sector lending. In PSL, banks have an objective that they have to lend 40% of their ANBC of the total credit to priority sector. Now we are discussing that banks may be many times unable to lend this 40% of their NBC to private sector. There might be many cases. Why? Because this is lending. It depends upon the risk profile of other person, the requirement of other person. This is lending. This is not completely in bank's hands. So therefore there might be shortfalls here. So a bank may not be able to achieve its targets of PSL lending. There might be a shortfall, but this shortfall has to be made up. There is no penalty as such. कोई penalty levy नहीं की जाएगी. There would be no penalty that would be levied, but this shortfall would be made up, and this shortfall is made up using two options which banks have. Banks के पास दो option होते हैं इस shortfall को overcome करने के लिए. Two options. One option is to invest the shortfall in RIDF of NABARD. One option is this, to invest the shortfall in RIDF of NABARD. And second option is to buy PSLCs from banks with surplus. To buy PSLCs from banks with surplus. There are two options which banks have if there is a shortfall in their priority sector lending commitments. Bank has committed and there is a shortfall. There are two options which the bank has. One option is that they can invest the amount of this shortfall, 20 रुपए shortfall है, they can invest this shortfall in RIDF of NABARD. What is RIDF? RIDF is Rural Infrastructure Development Fund. Rural Infrastructure Development Fund. This is what RIDF is. नाबार्ड क्या है? नेशनल एग्रीकल्चर एंड नेशनल बैंक फॉर एग्रीकल्चर एंड रूरल डेवलपमेंट, नाबार्ड. NABARD was set up in 1984. I think 84 is the right. 84 में सेटअप किया गया था. NABARD was set up in 1984 by RBI. Listen very carefully. NABARD क्या है? समझेंगे क्या है NABARD. Important from current affairs point of view as well. It was one of the institutions which was set up. नाम में क्या है? National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. So this bank, National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development Bank. नाबार्ड के नाम में तो बैंक आता है, लेकिन बैंक तो रिजर्व बैंक ऑफ इंडिया के नाम में भी आता है, रिजर्व बैंक ऑफ इंडिया. नाबार्ड इज नॉट अ बैंक इन कन्वेंशनल सेंस. नाबार्ड इज नॉट PNB, SBI, HDFC, ICICI. नाबार्ड इज नॉट दैट बैंक. नाबार्ड is a bank like RBI. NABARD is a bank like RBI. समझो NABARD को as rural areas का RBI. Think of NABARD as RBI of, think of it, just think, it's not RBI is RBI. सारे काम RBI करता है. All works are done by RBI. But just for understanding purpose, केवल समझने के लिए, only for understanding purpose, think of NABARD as गरीबों का RBI. ठीक है, इस याद रखने के लिए, obviously not गरीब, but rural areas का RBI. Think of NABARD as that. NABARD was a specialized institution set up by the RBI. Listen very carefully. NABARD is a specialized institution set up by RBI in order to usher in financial inclusion in rural areas, in order to encourage more and more financial institutions to go into rural areas and lend money there. NABARD क्या है? NABARD क्या करता है? NABARD बेसिकली रूरल एरियाज के अंदर बैंक्स को सेटअप करने में मदद करता है. बैंक्स सेटअप इन रूरल एरियाज. What NABARD does essentially is NABARD tries to encourage formal lending in rural areas. It is a body which has been set up for agriculture and rural development with specialization for finance. ध्यान से सुनना क्या करता है NABARD. Now I'm going to tell exactly what NABARD does. NABARD has been entrusted. Listen very carefully. अब मैं exact चीज बता रहा हूं क्या करता है NABARD. NABARD has been entrusted to perform regulation of regional rural banks. I'll repeat. NABARD has been entrusted by RBI to carry out regulation of regional rural banks. RBI banking system का regulator है. RBI regulates the banking system. RBI tells banks what to do, what not to do. RBI tells banks that 40% of your ANBC has to be lent to priority sector. RBI tells banks that 4% of your CRR, 20% in SLR. All these are regulatory mechanisms of RBI. RBI gives directions to banks कि ऐसा कर सकते हैं, ऐसा नहीं कर सकते हैं. So there is so much control that RBI, regulatory control that RBI exercises over all the banks in our country, all the banks. Some of that regulatory control, listen very carefully, some of that regulatory control has been given by RBI. RBI ने दिया है अपनी मर्जी से. NABARD के पास है नहीं, RBI ने अपनी मर्जी से दिया है. RBI has given, RBI has entrusted NABARD some of the regulatory control, not all, some of the regulatory control with respect to regional rural banks has been entrusted to NABARD by RBI. एग्जाम में क्वेश्चन पूछ लेते हैं, which amongst the following is a regulator of regional rural banks? If the option there is NABARD, NABARD becomes the right answer. If the options are both RBI and NABARD, then RBI becomes the right answer. NABARD has been entrusted by RBI to regulate some aspects, not all aspects, सारे aspects नहीं. NABARD रीजनल रूरल बैंक्स, RRBs को भी CRR SLR रिक्वायरमेंट है, बताया था. All banks in the country, any bank who is deposit taking will have CRR and SLR requirement. If you take deposits, then CRR SLR is there. You have to maintain CRR. Any bank, any kind of bank, small payment, कुछ भी टाइप का बैंक हो, if you take deposits, you have to have CRR SLR. NABARD will not lay down CRR SLR requirement for regional rural banks. NABARD नहीं बोलेगा, वो RBI नहीं बोला है. Some aspects of regulation with respect to regional rural banks have been entrusted to NABARD by RBI. कुछ aspects जैसे मैनेजमेंट कैसे फंक्शन करेगी या कैसे डिसीजन लेगी, क्रेडिट कैसे दिया जाना है, what will be the minimum requirements for giving credit. All these aspects are regulated by NABARD because it has been entrusted to do so by RBI. Why has it been entrusted to do so? It has been entrusted to do so because RBI is already doing so many functions, performing so many functions. Financial inclusion, especially in rural areas, is a very specialized function, very important and specialized function. और उस specialized function को perform करने के लिए, now I hope the puzzle falls into place. To perform that specialized function of financial inclusion, of ushering in financial inclusion in rural areas, RBI has created this body, NABARD. This NABARD body has been created for that particular purpose. And in order to do that purpose, RBI has also given certain regulatory powers to NABARD. NABARD का बेसिक काम क्या है? अब मैं आपको बेसिक काम भी बता दूं NABARD क्या करती है. रीजनल रूरल बैंक्स को तो रेगुलेट करती है. There are other functions also that NABARD performs. For example, what will NABARD do? NABARD will not lend money. Does RBI lend money? RBI doesn't lend money. NABARD also does not lend 1 rupee of money. NABARD 1 रुपया नहीं देता किसी को. RBI 1 रुपया नहीं देता किसी को. Me and you, nobody can go and borrow from RBI. Similarly, nobody can go and borrow from NABARD directly. There are some exceptional circumstances, wo not normal. If it is asked in question, market has no, NABARD does not lend to people. NABARD, like RBI, lends to financial institutions in rural areas. क्या बोला? गरीबों का RBI. रिलेट कर पाओगे अब इस चीज को? गरीबों का RBI क्या करता है? बैंकिंग सिस्टम को रेगुलेट. NABARD क्या करता है? रीजनल रूरल बैंक्स को रेगुलेट. RBI क्या करता है? It lends money to banks if they need money. What does NABARD do? NABARD lends money to financial institutions in rural areas if they need money. गरीबों का RBI. In rural areas, if there is a financial institution which needs money, it can go to NABARD. NABARD will lend to that financial institution. उस FI को जाके NABARD will give loan. NABARD will not give loan to, let's say, a farmer. NABARD will give loan to an FI, financial institution, which can then give loan to whomsoever it wants. Bank can give loan to whomsoever it wants. FI, who has taken money from NABARD, can give loan to whomsoever it wants. This is what NABARD does. NABARD has a fund which is called as RIDF, Rural Infrastructure Development Fund, RIDF. ये RIDF वो fund है which is made up from banks' contribution in shortfall of their priority sector lending commitments. If banks fall short of, जैसे 20 rupees, bank is falling short of this 20 rupees, this 20 rupees bank has to, मैंने क्या बोला था? This shortfall has to be made up. अब मेरे ख्याल से चीजें समझ में आ रही होंगी. This shortfall has to be made up. This 20 rupees has to be deposited by this bank. बैंक अब क्या करेगा? 20 रुपए RIDF में डाल देगा, Rural Infrastructure Development Fund, which is maintained by NABARD. From this fund, NABARD will invest in rural, as the name suggests, rural infrastructure development projects. NABARD will use money from this fund to invest in rural infrastructure development projects. It may use money from this fund to give money to financial institutions which are operational in rural areas. It may use money for any rural development purpose. NABARD के ऊपर है. अब पॉइंट क्या है कि ये पैसा नाबार्ड के पास चला गया है. You were not able to lend there, you have to invest that money here. So this shortfall has to be made up. So bank will have to contribute whatever the shortfall is in this RIDF. यहां पे आपको contribute करना पड़ेगा. Now, If bank had lent this money, ये 20 रुपए बैंक lend करता, if bank had lent this money, bank would have earned an interest. इसके ऊपर interest मिलता ना बैंक को. This was ultimately lending by the bank. If bank had lent this money, then bank would have earned interest. In this case, bank is investing this money in RIDF. In this case, bank gets a fixed interest of 8%. 8% का interest bank को fixed interest मिलता है इसके ऊपर. When bank lends money to RIDF, when bank is giving money to RIDF of NABARD, in this case, bank will get a fixed rate of interest of 8%. If it had lent the money instead, if instead it had lent 20 rupees, then it would have gotten some more interest on lending this money. Because it was not able to lend, it is giving this money to RIDF on which it earns a lesser rate of interest. This is like a cost to banks. ये एक तरीके की बैंक को cost है. This is what is called as opportunity cost. Lost benefit. There is a benefit which is lost. Bank has lost the benefit in form of earning a higher rate of interest if it would have lent this money somewhere else. As in priority sector only. But because it was unable to lend, therefore it is forced to lend this money to RIDF of NABARD, where it will earn a fixed rate of interest of 8% only. Mind you, ध्यान रखना, lending under priority sector is not done at any concessional rate. Priority sector में जो lending होती है, it is not done at any concessional rate. It is done at market rate of interest. Lending under priority sector, for example, to agriculture. Within agriculture, sub-target of small and marginal farmer. To renewable energy projects, to infrastructure projects. Lending under priority sector, lending for priority sector purposes is not done at any concessional rate. कोई concessional rate पे नहीं है कि agriculture को lend करना है तो bank will lend at 7% rate of interest or 3% rate of interest. There is no concession which is given to a sector in which money is being given. Simply the requirement is money has to be given to a particular sector. Only this is the requirement. Is this clear? This can be asked as a question in prelims. दो statement होंगी. One statement, which of the following is right about priority sector? First statement, under priority sector, banks have to lend 40% of their deposits to priority sector. Statement 2, loans under priority sector are given at a concessional rate of interest. बताओ, which of the two statements is right or wrong? Statement 1, banks have to lend 40% of their deposits to priority sector. Statement 2, lending under priority sector is done at a concessional rate of interest. Both statements are wrong. दोनों statements गलत हैं. First statement में क्या गलत है? 40% of their total credit, aggregate net bank credit, not deposits, aggregate net bank credit has to be given. Second statement में क्या wrong है? PSL loans are not given at any concessional rate. They are given at a market determined rate of interest. So a farmer goes, bank will charge from that farmer whatever the risk profile of that farmer is. भाई आपको लोन चाहिए, आपको लोन मिलेगा 10, 11, 12, 13%, जो भी रेट आपका बनता है इसके ऊपर. You will not get loan at any concessional rate of interest. There is a different scheme of the government under which concession is given to certain sectors on borrowing from banks. I'll repeat. Under priority sector, no concession. Priority sector में कोई concession नहीं है. There is a different scheme of the government under which concessional loans are provided. That scheme is called ISS, Interest Subvention Scheme. Interest Subvention Scheme. ये scheme है, Interest Subvention Scheme. This is a scheme of government. ये सरकारी scheme है, सरकार गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया की scheme है, ISS. Priority sector lending is a regulatory requirement, qualitative tool by RBI. Under PSL, there is no concession which is given on lending. Simply RBI says you have to lend this much money to these sectors. Under ISS, under ISS, Interest Subvention Scheme. This is a scheme under which government says that as the name suggests, interest subvention, that loans will be given at a cheaper rate of interest to some sections of population. तो let's say सरकार ने बोला ISS के eligible beneficiaries हैं farmers, मान लो government ने बोला, government says that a farmer will get loan at a concessional rate of interest. In this, government will say that, let's say whatever be your rate of interest, 4% of that interest will be borne by government. मान लो एक फार्मर है, उसको बैंक से लोन मिलता है 11% रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट पे. He gets loan from the government, from the bank at 11% rate of interest. Now, out of this 11%, 7% will be paid by the farmer, 4% will be paid by the government. This 4% is paid by the government under interest subvention scheme, not under priority sector. Priority sector की requirement क्या थी? Requirement of priority sector was that only that this farmer should be given loan. 40% of bank's loan must be given to priority sector, जिसके अंदर सब target of agriculture. I hope this is clear to everybody. PSL loans at market rate of interest, not at concessional rate of interest. So if bank would have lent this money, 20 rupees to a farmer, bank would have earned, let's say, 11% rate of interest, but because it was unable to do so, therefore it is earning only 8% interest from NABARD under investment in RIDF. So it is like a lost cost. Benefit has been foregone. 3% interest आप कम कमा रहे हो because you were unable to lend. So that is about first option which the bank has in order to make up for the shortfall. पहला option समझ में आया क्या है? Invest in RIDF of NABARD. That is first option. Second option is, now this is a recent option introduced in 2015. ये 2015 में option introduce किया गया था. Recent option introduced. Second option is that banks can buy PSLCs from banks with surplus. PSLCs क्या है? PSLCs are priority sector lending certificates. Priority sector lending certificates, PSLCs, priority sector lending certificates. क्या है PSLCs? Under PSLC, let's say there are two banks, A and B. Both have a target to give 40% of their net loans to priority sector. Let's say bank A का जो 40% target है, that comes out to be 80 rupees. And बैंक B का जो टारगेट है, टारगेट अमाउंट, बैंक B का जो टारगेट अमाउंट है, दैट कम्स आउट टू बी लेट्स से 40 रुपीज. मान लेते हैं बैंक B ने टोटल लेंडिंग 100 रुपए की करी है, बैंक A ने टोटल लेंडिंग 200 रुपए की करी है, एंड बेस्ड ऑन दैट 40% 80 रुपीज, 40% 40 रुपीज. एक्चुअल लेंडिंग टू प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर. बैंक A हैज लेंट, मान लो बैंक ने एक्चुअल लेंडिंग टू प्राइवेट सेक्टर, बैंक ए हैज बीन एबल टू लेंड 90 रुपीज, whereas बैंक बी हैज बीन एबल टू लेंड ओनली 30 रुपीज. बैंक ए ने 90 रुपीज लेंड किए, बैंक बी हैज बीन एबल टू लेंड ओनली 30 रुपीज आउट ऑफ इट्स एक्चुअल टारगेट. Therefore, bank A is in a 10 rupees surplus, whereas bank B is in a 10 rupees deficit, shortfall. Bank B has a shortfall of 10 rupees, bank A has a surplus of 10 rupees. If we look at the economy में total credit was 200 by bank A, 100 by bank B, 300 rupees. और 300 रुपीज का 40% होता है 120 रुपीज. 120 रुपीज वॉज द रिक्वायरमेंट ऑफ टोटल लेंडिंग टू प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर. ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या था कि 300 रुपए अगर इकोनॉमी में लेंड हो रहे हैं, 200 बाय ए, 100 बाय बी, इफ 300 रुपीज आर बीइंग लेंड, देन 120 मस्ट बी गिवन टू प्राइवेट सेक्टर, एंड दैट 120 वॉज डिवाइडेड एज 80 and 40. This bank achieved surplus, this bank was in deficit. But the total lending to priority sector is still 120 rupees. तो टारगेट तो यहां पे अचीव हो ही रहा है ना. So in 2015, one extra option was introduced. One extra option that what can banks do if they are in shortfall. The option that was introduced was that this bank which is in deficit can purchase a certificate of these 10 rupees from a bank which is in surplus. इससे सर्टिफिकेट खरीद लो, परचेज द सर्टिफिकेट फ्रॉम दिस बैंक विच इज इन सरप्लस. दिस सर्टिफिकेट ऑफ सरप्लस is called a priority sector lending certificate, PSLC. अब देखो, there might be a bank C, there might be a bank D, there might be a bank E. Let's say ये सारे डिफॉल्टर हैं, बैंक B, C, D, E सब डिफॉल्टर हैं, and only bank A is in surplus. टोटल डिफॉल्ट जो है, टोटल शॉर्टफॉल, बैंक B का 10 रुपए है, बैंक C का भी 10 रुपए है, बैंक D का 20 रुपए है, बैंक E का 20 रुपए है. Only one bank is in surplus and rest all are in shortfall. So what will happen? All these banks would also, इनके पास दो ऑप्शन है सब बैंक्स के पास. Either they purchase, they invest in RIDF of NABARD or they purchase these priority sector lending certificates from bank A. All of them can bid. बैंक A की मर्जी, जो सबसे ज्यादा पैसा देगा बैंक A को, बैंक A will give money to that particular bank. Bank A will give these priority sector lending certificates to that particular bank. So these PSLCs are tradable. Tradable मतलब they can be purchased from bank A by bank B, by bank C, by bank D, by bank E. Anybody can purchase them. One bank has surplus, others are in deficit. Those who want, they can purchase these certificates from bank A. It is just one more option. केवल एक ऑप्शन एक्स्ट्रा दिया गया है. Just one more option has been given. One option is already there, RIDF. You can keep on putting money in that RIDF if you are in shortfall. Otherwise, you can purchase the surplus. You can purchase the surplus certificates from a bank which is in surplus. So this is the second option. This was introduced in 2015 कि banks RIDF में invest करने के बजाय ऐसे भी they can make up for that shortfall. When this bank B purchases this certificate, 10 रुपए का इसने सर्टिफिकेट परचेज किया, इट परचेजेस सर्टिफिकेट ऑफ 10 रुपीज. नाउ बैंक बी विल टेल टू आरबीआई, आरबीआई को बताएगा भाई देखो ये 30 रुपए मेरे 30 रुपीज आई हैव लेंट टू प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर, और ये रहा 10 रुपए का सर्टिफिकेट. दिस इज 10 रुपीज सर्टिफिकेट दैट आई हैव परचेज फ्रॉम बैंक ए. दैट बैंक ए वाज इन सरप्लस एंड आई हैव परचेज दिस सर्टिफिकेट फ्रॉम बैंक ए, एंड दिस इज समथिंग दैट कैन बी यूज्ड बाय बैंक बी इन ऑर्डर टू fulfill its requirement of priority sector lending. 30 rupees like this and 10 rupees of certificate like this. माइंड यू दिस इज ओनली अ सर्टिफिकेट. केवल ये एक सर्टिफिकेट है कि बैंक बी ने बैंक ए को 10 रुपए दे दिए हैं. केवल एक सर्टिफिकेट है. लेंडिंग टू प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर, एक्चुअल लेंडिंग टू प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर इज स्टिल डन बाय बैंक ए. बैंक बी हैज ओनली परचेज्ड अ सर्टिफिकेट फ्रॉम ए. बैंक बी हैज नॉट परचेज्ड दीज लोन्स फ्रॉम ए. जो 10 रुपए के लोन है, ये लोन परचेज नहीं किया. बैंक बी हैज नॉट परचेज कि भाई यू हैव गिवन 10 रुपीज एक्स्ट्रा, तो ये जो 10 रुपए के एक्स्ट्रा लोन है ये हमको दे दो, अज्यूम कि ये हमने दिए हैं. ऐसा नहीं. बैंक बी हैज नॉट परचेज दीज लोन्स. द पर्सन हु हैड बोरोड मनी, दीज 90 रुपीज जो बोरो किए हैं और एक्स्ट्रा 10 रुपीज जो बोरो किए गए हैं, द पर्सन हु हैज बोरोड मनी हैज बोरोड मनी फ्रॉम ए, नॉट फ्रॉम बी. There is only a transaction between A and B with respect to certificate. केवल एक सर्टिफिकेट है. A proof that B has given 10 rupees to A, and out of the total 90 rupees that A has lent, 10 rupees came from B. 10 रुपए B से आए थे. Just that. Loan has been given from A, not from B. But B can now use this certificate to fulfill its commitments under priority sector lending requirements. This is what PSLCs are. Priority Sector Lending Certificates, PSLCs. A really important concept from the context of current affairs. So this is about PSLCs, bank nationalization and financial inclusion. ठीक है? It's 7 o'clock. आप लोग कह रहे थे ब्रेक नहीं देते. ठीक है, चलो ब्रेक नहीं देते हैं, तो प्लीज स्टार्ट राइटिंग देन. Please start writing. I'll dictate to you and then लगभग 20-25 मिनट लगेंगे. About 25 minutes it will take for me to dictate, and then we'll start with discussion on structure of the banking system. Structure of the banking system as in merger of banks. That is something which is important, very very important from current affairs point of view. Merger of banks. उसमें current affairs की बातें भी करेंगे. ठीक है? Please give heading. Please start writing. New heading. Write down banking. Give heading banking. give heading banking. First heading, write down types of banks. Write down types of banks. Write down refer printed material. Refer printed material. Types of banks और उसमें लिखो refer printed material. Please write down refer printed material. इसी के नीचे स्टार लगा के लिखो. स्टार लगा के लिखो small finance banks and payments bank. Small finance banks and payment banks. Write down small finance banks and payment banks. Write down these two differentiated banks. These two differentiated banks were set up with the objective of furthering financial inclusion, with the objective of furthering financial inclusion by leveraging leverage मतलब समझते हो leverage, by leveraging, using something, lever, leverage, the word comes from lever, by leveraging technology for their efficient operations, by leveraging technology for their efficient operations, and their specialization in providing banking services, and their specialization in providing banking services in specific areas, full stop. एक और स्टार मार्क लगा के नेक्स्ट लाइन में लिखो, वन मोर स्टार मार्क एंड राइट डाउन स्मॉल फाइनेंस बैंक्स आर small finance banks are small because the amount of loans which they give primarily comprise of small amounts, primarily comprise of small amounts, full stop. 75% of their loans, 75% of their loans are less than rupees 1 lakh in value. 75% of their loans are less than rupees 1 lakh in value. Full stop. Next line में payment banks only take deposits. Payment banks only take deposits with the objective of rationalizing and quickly transferring money, rationalizing the costs and quickly transferring the money, full stop. They do not lend out money to any person, full stop. small portion of their deposits, small portion of their deposits, small portions of their deposits can be invested in certain designated assets, can be invested in certain designated assets, comma, still they cannot lend this money, still they cannot lend this money, full stop. Next subheading, write down financial inclusion, financial inclusion, write down, देखो financial inclusion में लिखो, financial inclusion means FI, write FI, financial inclusion means being able to access, financial inclusion means being able to access financial services, being able to access required financial services. Please use this word required as well. Being able to access required financial services. Financial inclusion means being able to access required financial services with an ability to make a choice, with an ability to make a choice, and at an affordable cost, with an ability to make choice at an affordable cost, choice के बाद comma, at an affordable cost and at the required time, and at the required time, full stop. Thus it has four pillars. Thus it has four pillars. Number one, access to formal financial system. First pillar लिखो, access to formal financial system. Access to formal financial system. Dash लगाओ इसमें लिखो, being a part of the financial system, being a part of the financial system by having a bank account, and being able to access that account, and being able to access that account when required, being able to access that account when required, full stop. Second point लिखो, availability of choices, availability of choices, dash लगा के लिखो, choices must be available, rather than just one option, of take or go, rather than just one option of take or leave, full stop. इसी में आगे लिखेंगे, write down, a person must have a variety of options. A person must have a variety of options to choose from amongst the manner, variety of options to choose from, amongst the manner in which he or she wants to, in which he or she wants to access the financial system, in which he or she wants to access the financial system. Full stop. Next, third pillar लिखो. Choices exercisable at an affordable cost and required time. Choices exercisable at an affordable cost and required time. I think this is self-explanatory. If you want to write, you can write exercise of choice must be at an affordable cost. And it should be exercisable. At the time of need. It should be exercisable at the time of need. Full stop. Last, fourth pillar, the capability to make a choice. Fourth pillar, the capability to make a choice. That is financial education. Full stop. Okay. Next subheading, write down bank nationalization. Write down bank nationalization. Write down bank nationalization में लिखो. The process of bank nationalization started in 1956. With the nationalization of the Imperial Bank, into State Bank of India. Full stop. The government subsequently nationalized. That is purchased banks from their erstwhile owners. Erstwhile. That is purchased banks from their erstwhile owners in various stages. Full stop. The objective was primarily to provide banking services. The objective was to primarily provide banking services to unbanked areas. Full stop. Till that time, banking services were restricted largely to urban areas, and were unaffordable and were unaffordable to most of the population, and were unaffordable to most of the population. Full stop. Lack of banking services, lack of access, lack of access to banking services, lack of access to banking services created conditions through which investment demands of the economy were limited, through which investment demands of the economy were limited, and money was not available, to meet consumption demand, Full stop. Let's explain this line a little bit further. इसके आगे डैश लगा, ऐसे लगा लो, एरो लगाओ और उसके आगे लिखो, एरो लगा के लिखो. Meaning since banking services were available to a select few, meaning that since banking services were available to a select few, comma, the opportunity to have financial savings, were limited. Opportunity to have financial savings were limited. Full stop. Most of the savings were done in physical assets, like land or gold, Full stop. Money that does not go to the banking system, money that does not go to the banking system, cannot be lent, relent, and thus money available for investment, was very limited. Full stop. At the same time, since banks were reluctant to lend, to general population at an affordable interest rate, since banks were reluctant to lend to general population at an affordable interest rate, comma, this also suppressed the consumer demand. Full stop. With these objectives, bank nationalization was carried out. With these objectives, bank nationalization was carried out. Full stop. In its objective of financial inclusion, in its objective of financial inclusion, bank nationalization has a mixed record. Full stop. While share of institutional credit, in rural areas increased, while share of institutional credit in rural areas increased, but the overall population having access to banking services, remained very low. Full stop. Since the past decade, government schemes such as zero balance accounts, target area based schemes such as lead bank scheme, and finally Jan Dhan Yojana have been able to increase financial inclusion, to a level that now almost 80% households, 80% population, that now almost 80% population and about 99% households, 80% population and about 99% households have bank accounts, and are availing formal financial services through them, Full stop. नेक्स्ट सबहेडिंग लिखो प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग, PSL, प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग PSL. Write down PSL. PSL is a regulatory requirement. By RBI. PSL is a regulatory requirement by RBI on banks under which the banks are required to lend, under which the banks are required to lend 40% of their ANBC, 40% of their ANBC, ब्रैकेट में लिखो aggregate net bank credit, 40% of their ANBC, in bracket write down aggregate net bank credit. Banks are required to lend 40% of their ANBC to certain designated sectors, called priority sectors, to certain designated sectors called priority sectors. Full stop. Today priority sectors constitute sectors such as agriculture, bracket में, with a subsector of small and marginal agriculture, bracket close, comma, renewable energy, comma, MSMEs, etc. ब्रैकेट में स्टार लगा के लिखो बड़ा बड़ा, रेफर द कंप्लीट लिस्ट फ्रॉम प्रिंटेड मटेरियल, लीव 3 लाइन्स ऑफ स्पेस, 3 लाइन का स्पेस छोड़ो, लीव 3 लाइन्स ऑफ स्पेस वेयर यू विल राइट names of all the sector. 3 लाइन का स्पेस छोड़ना, 3 or 4 lines, leave 4 lines space. Immediately बाद में next line whatever I'm going to dictate, don't write immediately, leave 4 line space. Why? Because when you are reading these notes, you will only refer to your printed material or internet for the first time. When you refer, then write these name of sectors. Okay? So leave 3 line space, please write it yourself. Right after 3-4 lines, लिखो उसके बाद, write down. If banks are in a shortfall, with respect to their PSL commitments, if banks are in a shortfall with respect to their PSL commitments, comma, then they have 2 options. First, invest the shortfall in RIDF of NABARD. Invest the shortfall in RIDF of NABARD. Full stop. लिखो, Rural Infrastructure Development Fund. Rural Infrastructure Development Fund. RIDF, Rural Infrastructure Development Fund. Bracket close, full stop. Bracket close, आगे लिखो इसी पॉइंट में, RIDF वाले पॉइंट में आगे लिखो, प्लीज राइट फर्दर. On investment in RIDF, the banks earn 8% interest. the banks earn 8% interest और 8% वैसे मैंने गलत आपको बता दिया. प्लीज कट 8%. प्लीज कट दिस नंबर 8%. 8% सही नहीं है. प्लीज कट. आई एम सॉरी. बैंक्स अर्न उसके बाद का काट दो. 8% इंटरेस्ट काट दो. ऑन इन्वेस्टमेंट इन RIDF, banks earn whatever interest is fixed by NABARD. Whatever interest is fixed by NABARD. Banks earn whatever interest is fixed by NABARD. Full stop. Next line में 3 stars mark. 3 stars and write down. Not next point, just next line. Mark 3 stars and write down. PSL loans are given at market rate of interest. PSL loans are given at market rate of interest and not at any concessional rate. And not at any concessional rate. Full stop. The government may on its own decide to bring some scheme under which concessional loans can be given. Full stop. Even in those schemes, comma, the banks will lend out. Even in those schemes, the banks will lend out the money. Banks will lend out the money at market rate of interest. At market determined rate of interest. Full stop. It is just that the government will partially bear the interest cost. Government will partially bear the interest cost. Bear की spelling सही लिखना, ठीक है? Government will partially bear the interest cost. Full stop. Next, second point, write down. In 2015, the government and RBI introduced an alternate option for banks to make up for the shortfall. In form of PSLCs. Priority sector lending certificates. In form of PSLCs, priority sector lending certificates. Full stop. Under this scheme, banks which are in shortfall. Under this scheme, banks which are in shortfall can purchase. Banks which are in shortfall can purchase certificates can purchase certificates, ब्रैकेट में लिखो PSLCs, can purchase certificates from those banks which have overshot their PSL commitments, which have overshot their PSL commitments. Full stop. These certificates, last few lines, these certificates are tradable in the market. These certificates are tradable in the market. Full stop. The bank who buys these certificates, the bank who buys these certificates does not, the bank who buys these, the bank which buys these certificates does not take over the loans, from the lending bank, full stop. Those excess loans are still on the books of the bank which had surplus, are still on the books of banks which have that surplus. Full stop. It is just a certificate. It is just a certificate which can be used to make up for a deficit bank's shortfall. It is just a certificate that can be used to make up for a deficit bank's shortfall. Full stop. ठीक है, चलो, with this we are done. ब्रेक नहीं दे रहा हूं. आई लीव इन 15 मिनट्स. 15 मिनट्स में वैसे 8 बजने 5 मिनट ही रह जाएंगे. हमने क्लास भी 15-20 मिनट लेट से स्टार्ट करी थी. एक और टॉपिक है, वो छोटा सा टॉपिक है एंड इट्स नॉट वेरी कॉम्प्लेक्स. आई मीन दीज टॉपिक्स आर नॉट कॉम्प्लेक्स ऑल्सो, लेकिन आप आई अंडरस्टैंड प्लीज. मेरे को मालूम है, आई हैव बीन टीचिंग दिस सब्जेक्ट फॉर लास्ट मेनी ईयर्स नाउ. आई नो दैट दिस गेट्स अ लिटिल बिट बोरिंग. आई नो दिस बट इंपॉर्टेंट है प्रीलिम्स पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से काफी ज्यादा. तो क्वेश्चन आर आस्क्ड, तो कुछ बोरिंग पार्ट भी करना ही पड़ेगा, है ना. ऐसी बात तो नहीं है सब कुछ. चलो, one part what I do today is merger of banks, bank mergers. I'll talk about this today, bank mergers. ठीक है, इसके बारे में बात कर लेते हैं. उसके बाद I'll answer the questions to many people's joy. I have not taken up the questions in the beginning today, or because I have not given break, so उस time भी नहीं है. I'll take up the questions at the end of the class now. ठीक है, I'll see there are many questions. class के end में लेता हूँ मैं. So I'll just talk about bank mergers for about 10-15 minutes and then we'll stop as in I'll start taking questions, and nothing new for the class then. So let me talk about bank mergers now. Bank mergers. We have got a Narasimhan committee. Narasimhan committee 1 and Narasimhan committee 2 on the structure of banking system, on the structure of banking system in India. थोड़ा सा आपका mind, we have been reading, I've been explaining so many things for so long, और उसके बाद लिखा है, तो चलो थोड़ा सा माइंड को ब्रेक देते हैं विदाउट गिविंग अ ब्रेक. स्टोरी सुनाते हैं आपको, स्टोरी सुनाते हैं. स्टोरी इज इन कंटेक्स्ट ऑफ समथिंग, ऐसा नहीं कि irrelevant story इन कंटेक्स्ट ऑफ समथिंग, जस्ट टू मेक द टॉपिक इंटरेस्टिंग टू यू. आई टेल यू अ स्टोरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर, इट्स नॉट अ स्टोरी, इट्स समथिंग विच इज, दिस इज समथिंग विच इज रियली इंपॉर्टेंट. जो स्टोरी मैं सुनाने जा रहा हूं, रियली इंपॉर्टेंट, बिकॉज इट कनेक्ट्स व्हाट वी आर स्टडीइंग हियर टू रियल वर्ल्ड, टू रियल इकोनॉमी. वो कनेक्शन वाला पार्ट आता है जहां पे, जैसे फाइनेंशियल क्राइसिस वाली बात बताई थी, सो नाउ रियल इकोनॉमी. Banks are the real economy. Let me tell you a story now. So there is a Narasimhan Committee 1 and 2, which talks about the structure of banking system in India. Basically it says that what should be the system, the structure of banking in India. Banking structure किस टाइप का होना चाहिए? How should the structure of banks be in our country? If we look at US, if we look at any Western country, any developed country, even China, if we look at even China, Japan, US, Germany, France, UK, किसी भी country में देखो, if you look at any of these countries, take for example, let's take the example of US और Germany, किसी का भी लो, there are so many big banks there. जैसे हमने कुछ दिन last class में हमने देखा था, big banks, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Credit Suisse, not Wells Fargo, very big banks, amongst the biggest banks of the world. And I said that these banks do not cater to retail customers like me and you. ये हमको cater नहीं करते हैं. They don't take deposits from us, they don't give loans to us. So how do and where do Americans do their banking? Or where do Germans or English or Japanese, where do they do their banking? The banking structure in these countries is a 3-tier banking structure, which is what Narasimhan Committee said. Banking structure in these countries, in most of the countries, is a 3-tier banking structure. You have small local banks at local level. Then you have regional banks, bigger banks at a regional level, and then you have national level banks, national level banks. This is the banking structure. और इसको अगर मैं एक एक नीचे पुश कर दूं, if I correct it a little bit, correct क्या? I'm just changing the terminology so that it is explained better. I'm just changing the terminology. I'm pushing regional नीचे, national नीचे. You'll get the context. So let me write local or regional banks as one, local and regional banks as one. Let me write it here. At second tier level, there are national banks, as in banks which have a national presence. And at top tier banks are banks which have an international presence, international. As in the biggest banks are here. A few biggest banks, let's say 4 or 5 very big banks or 10 very big banks. National banks, 4-5 यहाँ पे हैं, let's say 10 to 12 national level banks, banks which are operational at national level. And regional banks, there will be multiple, let's say 20-30 multiple local banks or regional banks. You go to America, an average American does not deal with Bank of America or Wells Fargo or all these big banks. Americans as citizens there, they will not deal with it. Everybody will have, let's say, credit card issued by Wells Fargo. Everybody will have credit card issued by Bank of America or JP Morgan. JP Morgan says, I don't think so, issued credit card. But let's say they will have credit cards issued by them. They are using their credit cards. केवल credit card use कर रहे हैं. I don't have a bank account in ICICI Bank, लेकिन मेरे पास Amazon पे ICICI Bank वाला कार्ड है. आप में से कई लोगों के पास होगा. I don't have an ICICI Bank account. ICICI Bank has sold that card to me because it wants to make money out of me. It wants me to default on those payments, and it wants, once I default, then it will start earning interest from me. So that is ICICI Bank is selling that card to me. So Wells Fargo or Bank of America can sell cards to people, but it is not providing them those true banking services. I use ICICI Bank credit card, लेकिन ICICI Bank से अगर लोन लेना है तो मुझे शायद ICICI Bank में अकाउंट खुलवाना पड़ेगा. ICICI Bank मुझे लोन देगा. I have to give deposit to ICICI Bank. ICICI Bank will choose whether it wants to deal with me in providing those banking services. These big banks, they don't deal with normal population. These big banks, large banks, they deal with big companies only. वो उन्हीं के साथ डील करेंगे. ये बाकी सारी मार्केट, रिटेलर्स की मार्केट इनके लिए छोड़ रखी है, छोटे छोटे बैंक्स के लिए. So people are getting loans from their local banks, giving their deposits to their local banks. Or at national level, there are some big banks. If a person is living in New York, family lives in California, then you need a national level bank which has national level presence. So tab you will engage with such national level banks which have greater presence throughout the country. This is the structure of banking system in most of the countries. In India, this structure is not there. India में कैसा structure है? In India, the structure is that we only have national banks, national level banks. In India, we have national level banks. We only have this structure. There are very few local banks or regional banks. There might be some cooperative banks वगैरह हैं, जैसे cooperative. There are some regional banks, but they are very small in scale, very small in scale. National banks might be more active in a particular region, but जैसे let's say you have Punjab National Bank which is active mostly in northern part of the country, versus you have let's say Bank of Maharashtra, और Bank of Maharashtra तो बहुत छोटा बैंक है. Let's say you have Andhra Bank is active in let's say southern and eastern part of the country. So you might have public sector banks which are active in a certain region, but still you all banks are national bank. हमारे पास सारे के सारे national banks हैं. लगभग all banks they are national banks. If you look at, for example, Connaught Place, if you go to Connaught Place, in Connaught Place you will find branches of all the banks. सारे banks की branches हैं Connaught Place के अंदर. In Connaught Place you have branches of all the banks. Now there are different public, PNB भी है, SBI भी है, Punjab and Sindh Bank भी है, OBC which is now merged in Bank PNB, Bank of Baroda भी है. There are so many public sector banks who have branches there. If you go to Karol Bagh, for example, you will have so many public sector banks which have branches there. अब bank तो ultimately public sector, that means owner is the government, and same bank is fighting for market share with a bank of same owner. गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया का बैंक एसबीआई, गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया का बैंक पीएनबी, गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया का बैंक बैंक ऑफ बड़ौदा. These three banks are present in the same region and these three are fighting amongst each other for market share. What happens because of this? Repetition of efforts, redundancy in efforts, an inefficient banking system is a result of this. Work which would have been done by presence of one bank or two bank is being done by presence of 10 banks, 10 public sector banks. देखो, one thing is competition, एक चीज है competition versus एक चीज है overcrowding. You want a lot of competition but you don't want an overcrowding. Overcrowding नहीं चाहिए, you want a lot of competition. लेकिन अगर मेरी ही entities, if my entities are competing amongst each other, that means their energies are being wasted or not. If government of India's 10 banks are located in the same region, that means their energies are being wasted, obviously. The task which could have been done by presence of one bank of government of India in one region is being done by 10 banks of government of India and 5 banks of private sector. You would want, आप क्या चाहते हो? आप चाहते हो कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर जितना ज्यादा हो अच्छी बात है, कंपटीशन होना चाहिए. एवरी पर्सन इज ट्राइंग टू कॉम्पीट, बट इफ सेम ओनर्स वाले पर्सन कॉम्पीट कर रहे हैं, देन इट इज लीडिंग टू रिडंडेंसी ऑफ, इट इज वेस्टफुल एक्सपेंडिचर. मेंटेनेंस एक्सपेंडिचर ऑफ गवर्नमेंट वुड बी वेरी हाई देयर. भाई अल्टीमेटली सरकार से ही मेंटेनेंस एक्सपेंडिचर आ रहा है या फिर सरकार को कम प्रॉफिट मिलेगा, सो मेंटेनेंस एक्सपेंसेस वुड बी वेरी हाई, रिडंडेंसी, वेस्टेज, ऑल दीज थिंग्स वुड बी. So you would want some sort of consolidation. You require some sort of consolidation in the banking structure. Narsimhan committee proposed that you need some sort of consolidation. There is too much overcrowding in our banking sector. You need consolidation. Consolidation in the form which results in this type of banking structure, that you have some local banks or regional banks at the lowest level, you have some national banks which have a national presence, and then you have banks which can compete at international levels. Banks that compete at international level, you need such banks. SBI is the only bank which is there in, I think, top 50 or top 100 banks of the world, Indian bank. And why is SBI there? Top 50 में I think 48th या 49th number पे है SBI amongst the biggest banks of the world. बहुत ही poor position है SBI के हिसाब से देखा जाए. And why is SBI there? SBI is there at that position because government nationalized it in 1956. Number one, because government nationalized it in 1956, salaries of all government employees go to SBI. सारे सरकारी एम्प्लॉइज की, आप जब सिविल सर्वेंट बनोगे आपकी सैलरी भी एसबीआई में ही आएगी, एक्सेप्ट बैंक एम्प्लॉइज ऑफ अदर पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स. एवरी अदर गवर्नमेंट एम्प्लॉइज सैलरी कम्स इन एसबीआई बाय डिफॉल्ट. तो 1956 से इट हैज बीन न्यू ओनली बैंक. नो, गवर्नमेंट एम्प्लॉइज, द टॉप 1% ऑफ पॉपुलेशन की हम बात करें, पीपल हु आर एम्प्लॉयड इन द गवर्नमेंट, टॉप 1-2%, हाईएस्ट सैलरीज, most secure career, you are talking about those people. In rest of the economy, everybody aspires to become that government servant. किसी भी पोजीशन पे किसी भी तरीके से सरकारी नौकरी मिल जाए. So because SBI has been in that position since long, monopoly of the government, therefore SBI has become so big. Everybody has, let's say, quote unquote, most trust in SBI because it is government owned bank. Most of the people, their default account is always in SBI. So they will use SBI banking services. SBI is not big because it is more competitive. SBI is not big because it is more efficient than, let's say, HDFC or ICICI. SBI is not big because of that. SBI is big because of historical support that it has gotten from the government. Because government has pushed all its schemes through SBI. That is why SBI, not because of any efficiency. SBI has no efficiency as compared to, it is efficient, has become really efficient in past 10-15 years, no doubt about that, but that is because of competition. Competition की वजह से उसको भी efficient बनना पड़ रहा है. But at international level, SBI is nowhere. कहीं पे SBI stand नहीं करता international level पे. Why do we need this international level bank? हमें international level bank क्यों चाहिए? Why do we need this bank? And here comes the story. Quick story. You might have heard about 2016, I think it was, 2016 की बात है, 2015 की बात है. Modi ji went to Australia, and along with him went Mr. Adani, Gautam Adani. Australia में there is a province Queensland, and in Queensland there are coal mines, and those coal mines had to be auctioned. Coal mines को auction होने का मतलब क्या है? Coal mines had to be auctioned, meaning that some person, some company was to be given a right to mine coal from that coal mine. जैसे इंडिया में you have a coal mine. Coal is a public resource. It's located in land. Resources of the land are public resource. Government gives the right to mine those resources based on auctions. तो सरकार auction करके वो right देती है. Similarly, Australian government, Queensland state government, it was also supposed to auction that particular coal mine. It was supposed to auction that particular coal mine and give the right to mine coal from that to the highest bidder. ठीक है, अभी आपने देखा होगा लास्ट ईयर इंडिया ऑस्ट्रेलिया की जब सीरीज हुई थी, सो देयर वाज सम प्लैकार्ड होल्डिंग गाय केम टू द फील्ड, आल्सो फील्ड क्रैश किया था. नो अदानी इन क्वींसलैंड, नो अदानी इन कोल माइंस, कुछ. सो देयर वर सम पोस्टर्स लाइक दिस इन इंडिया ऑस्ट्रेलिया सीरीज, ऐसा कुछ था. सो व्हाट हैपेंड, अदानी वेंट देयर एंड देयर वाज अ मीटिंग विद the state chief minister, or जो भी वहां का होता है, there was a meeting with that, and Arundhati Bhattacharya, who was then the head of SBI, who was then the chief of SBI, she was also there. Adani went there, and Adani had a letter from SBI in which SBI had said that we will give loan to Adani if Adani wins this bid. अगर अदानी ये बिड जीत जाते हैं If he is able to win this bid, then we will give loan to them at some rate of interest. I'll repeat. A coal mine was supposed to be auctioned, number one. One of the participants and that auction was Mr. Adani, representing Indian interests there, Mr. Adani. Mr. Adani went there with Modi ji, with Arundhati Bhattacharya. It was a big deal. It was expected that Mr. Adani is going to win. Mr. Adani went there with a letter from SBI. SBI gave a letter. Chief CMD of SBI was there. Arundhati Bhattacharya was there then. With a letter that in case Mr. Adani wins this bid, then we will give loan. He was not given any loan. कोई उसको 1 रुपया नहीं दिया गया था. In case he wins this bid, he will be given this loan at this percentage rate of interest. Now, think about it. अभी कहानी इसके बारे में और बताता हूं. Similarly, similar incident भी बताऊंगा एक और. This was in 2012. ये 2012 की बात है मेरे ख्याल से, 12 या 11 की बात है. मोजाम्बिक में एक ऑयल वेल ऑक्शन होना था. देयर वाज एन ऑक्शन ऑफ ऑयल वेल. मनमोहन सिंह जी वेंट देयर इन मोजाम्बिक, and again Manmohan Singh ji did his diplomacy thing, and it was expected that when that oil block comes for auction, Mozambique government will treat Indian participant, which was ONGC, ONGC Videsh Limited. OVL एक company है, ONGC की foreign branch. So OVL was going to bid for that oil block. Basically जैसे वहां पे कोल का बिडिंग होनी थी, यहाँ पे एक ऑयल ब्लॉक की बिडिंग होनी थी. दैट who will get the right to mine, to quote unquote mine oil from this particular block. So जिसको भी राइट मिलेगा वो ऑयल बेचेगा. ऑयल बेचेगा बाहर में, तो ऑब्वियसली लॉट ऑफ प्रॉफिट्स. कोयले का माइन का, इफ यू गेट लाइसेंस टू माइन कोल, you will be able to sell coal, and therefore you will be making lot of profits. India is a deficient of oil. India imports coal, so naturally these were India's strategic interests to win that particular bid for ONGC, to win this bid for Adani. But as you know, vested interests, no Adani in Queensland. Adani Ambani की सर क्या फालतू की बात है. Who is competing there? Think about it. कौन compete कर रहा है? ONGC सरकारी कंपनी, inefficient. ONGC के साथ compete करने आई है रॉयल डच शेल. ONGC के साथ compete करने आई है साइनोपेक. ONGC के साथ OVL के साथ compete करने आई है सऊदी अरेबिया की अरामको कंपनी. The biggest oil companies of the world, which have billions and billions of dollars at their disposal, trillions dollars of market cap, they have come there to bid. रॉयल डच शेल, जो कि ब्रिटेन और नीदरलैंड डच, इन दोनों की कंबाइंड कंपनी है. रॉयल डच शेल हैज एक्सेस टू लोन फ्रॉम बैंक्स इन ब्रिटेन एंड नीदरलैंड्स एट एन इंटरेस्ट ऑफ 0.5%. 0.5% इंटरेस्ट रेट पे रॉयल डच शेल को लोन मिल रहा है. साइनोपेक, जो चाइना की ऑयल कंपनी है, साइनोपेक हैज कम देयर bidding for that oil block with a guarantee that we will get loan from Bank of China at an interest rate of 0.25%. 0.25% पे हमको लोन मिलेगा जब हम बिड करेंगे. Biggest of biggest companies are there with guarantees that we have come here and we will, if in case we win, we have gotten loans at this rate of interest. और वहां पे जाके ONGC बिड कर रही है, क्वींसलैंड में जाके अदानी बिड कर रहे हैं कि हमको कितने लोन पे रेट मिलेगा, कितने इंटरेस्ट पे लोन मिलेगा, 7% पे. इफ ही इज गेटिंग लोन एट 7%, naturally his costs would be very high. If he is competing with the Chinese investor there, Chinese investor is also sitting in Australia because India has good strategic relations with Australia. Therefore, Australia is trying to create conditions कि भाई किस तरीके से चाइना को इस ऑक्शन से बाहर रखा जाए. तभी तो मोदी जी के साथ अंदानी गए हैं कि ऑस्ट्रेलिया इज ट्राइंग टू क्रिएट कंडीशंस दैट हाउ टू कीप चाइना आउट ऑफ दिस बिड. लास्ट ईयर चाइना परचेज्ड अ सिग्निफिकेंट शेयर इन HDFC बैंक. 1% से ज्यादा शेयर हो गया था चाइना का HDFC बैंक में. व्हेन लास्ट ईयर मार्केट क्रैश, चाइनीज सेंट्रल बैंक परचेज सम पार्ट ऑफ HDFC बैंक. तो इंडिया ने क्या किया? इंडिया सेड दैट any investment coming from India's neighboring countries would have to be approved by Indian government, except when it comes from Bangladesh, Nepal and Bhutan. A move ऑब्वियसली डायरेक्टेड एट चाइना. पाकिस्तान से तो कोई इन्वेस्टमेंट आएगा नहीं, म्यांमार से तो कोई इन्वेस्टमेंट आएगा नहीं इंडिया में, ऑब्वियसली चाइना से ही आएगा. अ मूव डायरेक्टेड. सो इंडियन गवर्नमेंट इज ट्राइंग टू क्रिएट कंडीशंस विदाउट नेमिंग चाइना so that China remains out of Indian economy. Australian government is trying to create conditions there so that others are unable to make the bid or others cost of this bid increase. बट वहां पे अदानी जी कंपीट कर रहे हैं कैसे? अदानी कंपीट कर रहे हैं बैठे 7% लोन के साथ, 7% इंटरेस्ट के साथ. ओएनजीसी वहां पे गई है, ओएनजीसी सेड दैट वी विल गेट लोन एट अ रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट ऑफ 5%. विल इट बी एवर एबल टू कंपीट? अगर फेयर ऑक्शनिंग हुई, क्या कभी जीवन में कभी जीत पाएंगे? कभी जीवन में नेवर. ऑब्वियसली 7% is his interest cost, whereas the investor from China says my interest cost is 1%. America has 0% interest rate, Europe has 0% interest rate. Their investors are going to invest in China, in Australia, in Mozambique. How much interest cost do they bear? 1%, 0.5%. Is an Indian investor ever going to be competitive at international level if he is getting loan at 7%? Never. And why is he getting loan at 7%? वो 7% के ऊपर भी लोगों ने बोला कि स्कैम है और SBI has been forced to give loan to Adani at 7%. SBI did not give 1 rupee, 1 रुपया SBI ने दिया. SBI ने बोला कि अगर वो जीतते हैं तो हम इनको 7% पे लोन देंगे. SBI ने एक पैसा नहीं दिया. Why was SBI giving loan at 7%? Because SBI's costs are very high. It cannot compete at international level. SBI's cost क्यों बढ़ी हुई है? क्योंकि SBI PNB से या फिर बैंक ऑफ बड़ौदा से कंपीट कर रहा है. SBI is not competing with world banks, world banks as in banks at the level of international stature. SBI is not competing with them. It cannot compete with them. SBI's energies are wasted by competing at this level. We do not have a bank, and if we do not have a bank which can compete at international level, then our enterprises will never be able to compete at international level. Why would Adani or Ambani, anybody, get a loan at a concessional rate of interest from Bank of America? Why would they get a loan at a concessional rate of interest from, let's say, Bank of China? Obviously, Bank of China will give to their own companies interest at a very loan at a very low rate of interest. अब Indian company कहां देखेगी? Indian company will look at an Indian bank. Which Indian bank can give loan? Only SBI has the money that can give loan to them. SBI can give loan to them at a minimum rate of 7%. उससे नीचे SBI भी नहीं दे सकता है. So SBI simply said कि भाई minimum rate जो हमारा है, whatever the minimum rate is, we will give you loan at that particular rate of interest. जो भी minimum rate है, we will give you loan at that particular rate of interest. तो उसी के अंदर इतना बवाल हो गया. Still not one unit of coal has been mined from there, despite Adani winning that bid, despite Australian government trying to ensure through Queensland government that bid is won by an Indian enterprise. Despite that, still it has not started. Why? Because of no bank can compete at international level. So you need banking system which can compete at international level, and for that you need mergers of banks, mergers and acquisitions to happen in bank. The recent government decisions to merge banks, जैसे PNB के अंदर 2 banks merge किए, SBI के अंदर सारे associate banks merge किए, वो सब SBI, State Bank of Patiala, बीकानेर, जयपुर, so and so, ठीक है. All these banks have been merged in SBI. Bharatiya Mahila Bank merged in SBI. So many mergers are going on right now in the banking sector. Why? Because you are trying to move towards this structure of banking. Move towards structure of banking in which there will be some local banks, a little bit less national banks, and a few international banks, banks at the top. It is envisaged that banks at the top in our country, probably they should be SBI, PNB, HDFC, ICICI Bank. ये envisaged है. Going forward, we have to see that how big do they become? Are they actually able to compete at international level or not? अभी की तारीख में none of them is able to compete. SBI biggest bank, it is nowhere close to at international standard, nowhere close. We would want eventually to reach this status so that we have a banking system that can compete. Unless we have a banking system that can compete at international level, our enterprises, our businesses will not be able to compete at international level. अगर Reliance को तेल बनाना है, ऑयल को रिफाइन करना है, लेट्स से Reliance तो चलो डेट फ्री कंपनी आज की तारीख में, सो कोई और एग्जांपल ले लेते हैं. लेट्स से ग्रासिम बिरला की कंपनी, बिरला ग्रुप. Let's say if Grasim has to set up, let's say cloth manufacturing unit in a country or thread manufacturing unit in the country, it will borrow at a high rate of interest. Whereas somebody has to set up a cloth manufacturing unit in China, they will be able to borrow at a very low rate of interest. So our interest costs are very high as compared to rest of the world, and therefore our product, our export would be automatically less competitive as compared to some other country. That is why we need banks at international level. That is why we need mergers and acquisitions to happen in the banking system. ठीक है, 5 मिनट ऊपर ही हो गए. चलो, so with this is about bank mergers. I'll dictate about bank mergers in tomorrow's class. कल क्लास है ना, तो कल मैं डिक्टेट करता हूं bank mergers के ऊपर. अब let me answer your questions. This is about bank mergers and bank structure of the banking system. I'll dictate it in tomorrow's class. ठीक है, Narasimhan committee I'll not dictate. What Narasimhan committee said, that you will have to look at from your printed material. Just have a look at it, just glance over it once. Don't need to remember anything. Nobody is ever going to ask कि Narasimhan committee 1 ने क्या recommend किया, Narasimhan committee 2 ने क्या recommend किया. Just have a look at it. Just try to understand what Narasimhan committee says. Nothing more than that. Remaining part of bank mergers, structure of the banking system, I'll dictate in tomorrow's class. And then tomorrow, कल हम फिर एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक स्टार्ट करेंगे एनपीएस का. ठीक है, ये बोरिंग वाले टॉपिक्स खत्म करके कल हम एक एनपीएस का टॉपिक स्टार्ट करेंगे, विच इज रिलेटिवली क्या है, विच इज फार लेस बोरिंग एज कंपेयर टू व्हाटएवर वी हैव डन. ठीक है, सो टुमारो विल स्टार्ट. नाउ लेट मी आंसर योर क्वेश्चंस. ठीक है, जिन्होंने क्वेश्चंस पूछे कृपया करके वो लोग रहें, बाकी इफ एनीबॉडी वांट्स टू गो यू आर फ्री टू. आई मीन आई एम एज इफ आई एम स्टॉपिंग यू एनीवेज. फर्स्ट निकिता's क्वेश्चन इज, काफी देर से निकिता का क्वेश्चन है, मैं देख रहा हूं. What is the recent crisis in SBI regarding negative rate of interest on bank deposits, and how it will divert a person towards stock market? Please elaborate the whole issue with its significance. Nikita, this question requires, as you have asked, a little bit elaborate answer. तो जो लोग हैं, please listen to that. I'll spend about 2 minutes. Remaining part you will be able to understand yourself. नेगेटिव इंटरेस्ट रेट्स ऑन डिपॉजिट बाय एसबीआई. जैसे देखो क्या है, बेसिकली वी हैव डिस्कस्ड स्पेक्युलेटिव डिमांड ऑफ मनी, एंड इन दैट स्पेक्युलेटिव डिमांड वी डिस्कस्ड दैट देयर आर 2 ऑप्शंस. आइदर यू पुट योर मनी इन सेविंग्स बैंक और यू इन्वेस्ट योर मनी इन सर्टेन एसेट. ये आपके पास ऑप्शन है. इन इंडिया मोस्ट ऑफ द मनी इज सेव्ड in form of physical or financial, is in form of physical assets like gold and land, and remaining money is saved in form of bank deposits. तो हमारे यहां फाइनेंशियल सेविंग्स जो हैं, सेविंग्स आर इन फॉर्म ऑफ बैंक डिपॉजिट्स. नाउ फॉर अ पर्सन बैंक डिपॉजिट्स आर नॉट वेरी हाई yielding. For me, I don't have lot of money in my bank deposit apart from what might be my precautionary demand, emergency demand. Apart from that, I don't have lot of money in my bank account. I invest almost all of my money. And that leads me to a situation in which my assets, my worth grows more than what it would have grown if I simply put my money in my bank account. अगर मैं बैंक अकाउंट में रखता तो आज मेरे पास मान लो x रुपीज होते, अगर मैंने अपना पैसा इन्वेस्ट किया तो मेरे पास आज 10x रुपीज है. सो इफ banks discourage people to keep money in bank accounts in some ways, for example through negative interest rates, then maybe it acts as a trigger for people to start channelizing their money in assets. Stock market is just one market where you can purchase assets. ठीक है. Hemant, what is contagion effect in context of crisis at China? How could Fed tapering affect the recent crisis of China? Contagion effect क्या होता है? Hemant, I've explained answer to both these things. Contagion effect is, remember हमने डिस्कस किया था 2007-8 फाइनेंशियल क्राइसिस. उसमें हमने क्या था, one sector fails that leads to collapse of entire economy. Financial sector, banking sector is that central sector which is linking each and every part of economy. बैंकिंग फाइनेंस सेक्टर जो है वो इतना क्रिटिकल क्रूशियल सेक्टर है जो पूरी इकोनॉमी को लिंक किया हुआ है. सो इफ समथिंग हैपेंस इन बैंकिंग सेक्टर इट इज गोइंग टू हैव अ कंटेजियन इफेक्ट ऑन एवरीथिंग एल्स. लेट्स से इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर सेक्टर फेल्स. जैसे चाइना की एक फर्म है जिसके बारे में आपने कल से परसों से न्यूज में पढ़ रहे होंगे. A firm in China fails, is unable to fulfill its debt obligations, that will have a huge effect on banking sector. If banking sector fails, then there is going to be a contagion effect. इसको domino effect भी बोलते हैं. Domino effect मतलब जैसे सारे आपने एक You must have seen those animations, deck of cards of a, क्या बोलते हैं, deck of ताश के पत्ते सारे ऐसे खड़े हैं, you push one and all start falling in line. That is a domino effect. ठीक है, this is one. Regarding effect of Fed tapering on crisis of China, this I have explained. Fed tapering effect on India, other developing economies, exactly the same effect on China as well. So money has been invested in China also because of quantitative easing. If money flows out, it will certainly affect China as well. Manu का question है, sir, in IBC certain terms like committee of creditors, pre-pack resolution are very complex to understand. Will you explain them in your upcoming classes? Of course I will explain, Manu, do not worry. I understand that the broad purpose is not to close business as far as possible and it close and liquidate in maximum possible. IBC हम कल की क्लास में कर, tomorrow, कल की क्लास में तो नहीं हो पाएगा IBC, tomorrow we'll not be able to do it. Tomorrow we'll explain NPAs. Hopefully हम IBC कल start कर देंगे. Just 1.5 class for banking remains. तो कल की क्लास में we'll be able to do NPAs. एनपीए में एक्सप्लेन करने का बहुत कुछ होता है क्योंकि प्रोविजनिंग वगैरह वाली जो टर्म है ना वो थोड़ी डिफिकल्ट होती हैं. इट्स डिफिकल्ट टू अंडरस्टैंड. वंस यू अंडरस्टैंड इट बिकम्स क्वाइट इजी. प्रोविजनिंग, देन वील मूव ऑन टू रिजोल्यूशन ऑफ एनपीएस एंड देन इट विल कम आईबीसी. सो आई विल एक्सप्लेन इट देयर. हो सकता है कल ही हो जाए या फिर आई हैव रियलिस्टिक एक्सप्लेनेशन. रियलिस्टिक एक्सपेक्टेशन इज डे आफ्टर टुमारोज क्लास. Shubha Lakshmi's question is, sir, recently under GSAP program, RBI is buying large amount of bonds. It is also a type of quantitative easing. Yes, you can say it is type of QE. QE is a, let me say it, QE is a proper noun. Proper noun matlab the act of bond buying which was done in United States. That is what is specifically called quantitative easing. Usko quantitative easing bolte hain, QE. It is known with some other names in in England, with some other name in Europe, with some other name in Japan. Whether RBI's bond buying program is QE or not, we have seen that QE is majorly about scale of operations. RBI's scale of operations have increased drastically in last 1 year, no doubt about that. But हाँ, QE के level के हैं कि नहीं अभी हम नहीं कह सकते. I don't think so that we can say that it is QE as of now. ठीक है, कह सकते हैं as I said QE is simply the differences of scale. Yes, RBI's operations, the scale have increased drastically. We can or we may not call it QE. ठीक है. Bond yields have fallen, that means government can raise loans at cheaper rate. Yes, all is right. How will it impact private sector and how will stable yield can be achieved through this program, because it will lead to depreciation of rupee as well. Depreciation of rupee because of this. This is something that I will explain in our exchange rate classes. What effect does it have on domestic currency? While explaining quantitative easing, जब मैंने आपको लिखवाया था, when I dictated QE in the next class, QE के ऊपर मैंने आपको कुछ पार्ट फर्स्ट क्लास में लिखवाया था और कुछ पार्ट QE का I dictated to you in the next class. In that next class, I had dictated some parts about effect of QE on domestic currency and foreign currency. I dictated some part. Some part I have dictated that should be able to answer your questions for now, but more on this in our foreign exchange chapter. जब हम रुपी डॉलर का exchange rate determination की बात करेंगे ना, then we'll talk about it. How is value of rupee determined and how does this affect? How do domestic interest rates affect that? Exchange value of rupee, how do domestic interest rates affect? We'll talk about it then. अभी नहीं करेंगे. Another doubt, there is rise in US Treasury bond yield which is in news. Yes. Could you please establish the link how bond yields in US will push up yields in India and interest rate in India and how it will affect dollar rupee exchange rate? Dollar rupee exchange rates I will not explain now, but हाँ bond yields वाला I will explain. Because that we have already explained, that I will explain. देखो, how will rise in bond yields affect rise in bond yields in India? Simple, it's quite easy. Think about it like this. Why are bond yields in US rising? Bond yields are rising because Federal Reserve is tapering its bond buying program. If it is tapering its bond buying program, then what happens? Then bonds become cheaper. When bonds become cheaper, yields increase. यहां तक तो हमें क्लियर होना चाहिए. I'll repeat. Federal Reserve is reducing its bond buying program. When it is reducing, that means it's buying less of government bonds now. When it's buying less of government bonds now, that means they are now becoming cheaper. Pehle they were becoming costlier, now they are becoming cheaper. When bonds become cheaper, yields increase. Sasta bond ho gaya, to ab uski yield, effective earning that you will have from bond, that will increase. So number one. Number two, when American bond yields increase, because American Federal Reserve is buying less of government bonds, it is a signal for American money invested in India that pull out from here and start investing in India. American money से Indian government bonds भी purchase हुए होंगे कि नहीं? American money which came to India to be invested, that would have purchased bonds of Indian government as well. FIIs are allowed to buy government of India bonds. They can do whatever they want. They can purchase any instrument which they want. So foreign institutional investors, American money would have purchased Indian government bonds. If they start selling Indian government bonds, what will happen to price of Indian government bond? They will also start reducing or not? Indian government bonds are being sold. Indian government bonds sell हो रहे हैं, इसका मतलब क्या है? Bonds become cheaper, therefore their yields increase. Indian government का bond भी, उसकी भी yield increase होगी. Why? Both are moving simultaneously. American government bond, Indian government bond. Why? Because now American money is leaving Indian shore and therefore Indian bond is becoming cheaper and hence yield on it is becoming higher. Clear? Manu ka question hai, sir, what are your views on the new show named Economic Sutra on Sunset TV by Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor? Will it be useful for our preparation? I have not seen that show. Sunset TV pe Sanjeev Sanyal. But Sanjeev Sanyal is a very good writer. He's a member of Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council. He's, I think, fairly educated person, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. I have seen his interviews earlier. His interviews are really good. बहुत अच्छे interviews होते हैं. He talks sense. Sense as in, he talks about economy as in how it affects us. He is not talking about theoretical aspects. Okay? He talks about economy as in, as economy affects people, industry, as in industry, businesses, normal people. He talks like that. So his way of speaking is very easy to understand. I have not seen that show. I don't know what he talks about on that show. लेकिन मैंने उनके interviews देखे हैं पहले and I think that it should be good. I think it should be good. I'll not suggest अभी कि मैं ये नहीं बोलूंगा कि आप उसका शो देखो जाके वहां पे सनसेट टीवी के ऊपर. I sincerely hope, I expect it is going to be great. Especially because it is not on some TV news channel जहाँ पे debate करनी है. It might be interviews, it might be he speaking something about Indian economy. So I think that would be good. ठीक है? अगर ज्यादा लंबे समय का हुआ, 1 घंटे वगैरह का हो तो मत देखना, आधे घंटे का हो तो देख सकते हो. I have not seen, but I hope it is going to be good. I have not seen, but I expect it should be good. Next is Tanvi's question. What is prompt corrective action framework? PCA I'll discuss in tomorrow's class. कल PCA discuss कर दूं. तन्वी प्लीज पूछना PCA क्या है, prompt correct. अब tomorrow's class में नहीं, tomorrow's class मतलब इसमें आपको पूछने की जरूरत नहीं पड़ेगी. PCA we'll discuss it with respect to NPAs. जब हम non performing asset discuss करेंगे, we'll discuss prompt corrective action. That is also part of RBI's regulatory arsenal. So we'll discuss PCA then. How is it help? Is it helping in effective monetary? It has nothing to do with monetary policy transmission. Prompt corrective action and monetary policy transmission are completely different things. PCA is with respect to health of banks. Monetary policy transmission is whether they are able to translate monetary policy to the economy or not. Completely different thing. Completely. Variable reserve ratio is same as cash reserve ratio. I don't know what I'm sorry. I don't know. I'm really sorry what variable reserve ratio is. If it is something that has come up very recently, I'll have a look. I'll have to look at it. मैं नोट कर लेता हूं. Variable reserve ratio. I'll see what variable reserve ratio is. I'll talk about variable reserve ratio in tomorrow's class. कल बताता हूं क्या है. Next, Advait. Sir, but we must take into account the fact that in the past decade there has been a rapid increase in access to technology which coincides with the increase in financial inclusion. Further, we can add to the point that around 2015, the per capita income of Indian households had increased, thus providing incentive for banks to provide services to a larger potential consumer base. Oh, certainly yes, Advait, perfectly right. Advait's question is that it is not just, I think you want to say this, that it was not just Jan Dhan Yojana which led to so much great financial inclusion, but it was other factors also. बिल्कुल अद्वैत, बिल्कुल कोई डाउट नहीं है. Having said that, I will still say Jan Dhan Yojana accelerated the pace at which financial services were going to reach people tremendously. मतलब not just exponentially, double, triple, quadruple exponentially. इतनी तेज जन धन. By these factors, देखो, in hindsight we can say कि भाई हाँ पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स नहीं होते तो जनधन योजना सक्सेसफुल नहीं होती. सही बात है, शायद नहीं हो पाती. अगर टेक्नोलॉजी नहीं होती तो जनधन योजना सक्सेसफुल नहीं होती. बिल्कुल सही बात है. इफ टेक्नोलॉजी वाज नॉट देयर, जनधन योजना वुड नॉट हैव बीन सक्सेसफुल, may not have been successful. If per capita incomes of people had not increased, they would not have an incentive to be part of formal financial system. Again, we can say it's perfectly right. Having said that, Jan Dhan Yojana's role in making the financial services reach the poor is unparalleled. And see, it is not just about the present government scheme. Even the previous government said that now we need to make digital transfers of payments to people. Direct transfer scheme, direct transfer Modi ji ne start nahi kiya. Direct transfer scheme was started as a pilot project by Manmohan Singh ji. ठीक है? But Modi ji took it to an altogether different level. Why? Because first he implemented Jan Dhan Yojana, and therefore now everybody has accounts, so therefore direct benefit transfer can be implemented. Secondly, many schemes they were transferred to direct benefit transfer, through which more efficient transfer of money could take place, and that was certainly assisted by presence of technology. So this is a continuous process advised by economists even before that, even before the present government came. But Jan Dhan Yojana has a huge role to play in this. Bharat, sir, do deficit bank get interest from lending bank on certificate? And when would they get certificate investment back from lending bank? So do they get an interest or not? They will not get any interest. कोई interest नहीं मिलेगा उनको. These priority sector lending certificates will be traded at some market price. मैंने बोला ना tradable है. तो मान लो 10 रुपए का सर्टिफिकेट है, इट विल बी ट्रेडेड एट अ प्राइस ऑफ लेट्स से ₹8. मैंने परचेज किया है 8 रुपए का. 10 रुपीज सर्टिफिकेट, आई हैव परचेज इट एट ₹8. तो मतलब आई एम गोइंग टू शो 10 रुपीज हैव बीन लेंट, बट वेयर एज आई हैव स्पेंट ओनली 8. तो इफेक्टिवली 2 रुपए का मुझे फायदा हो रहा है. इफेक्टिवली 2 रुपीज इज माई प्रॉफिट हेयर, और द गेन दैट आई वुड हैव गॉट. वो जो लेंडिंग बैंक है, सरप्लस बैंक, वो कुछ इंटरेस्ट पे नहीं करेगा इस पीएसएलसी के ऊपर. इट सिंपली ट्रेडेड, एंड दैट प्राइस ऑफ पीएसएलसी विल इनकॉर्पोरेट द इंटरेस्ट विच कुड हैव बीन पेड. सिंपली दैट. Surya, so what is that bank issuing PSLCs get from certificate receiving bank? In case of investment in RFID, NABARD will pay interest to investing bank, like that PSLC issuing bank get any interest? Surya, you are mixing things, you are opposing things here. The bank which is issuing PSLC, that bank will earn interest from 10 rupees extra which it has lent. Surya and Bharat, both of your questions would be answered. The bank which is issuing priority sector lending certificate, that bank will get interest on the loan. I have given loan, so I will get interest from that loan or not? This interest is not given to that bank who has purchased PSLCs from me. This interest is not given. I am getting this interest. I am selling this PSLC to that bank at certain price. कुछ price पे मैंने उसको बेचा है. 10 rupees worth, 8 rupees का मैंने बेच दिया. So that bank is happy and I am happy. So this is how trading takes place. ठीक है? I'll not go into more details of this. So फिर complex हो जाएगी trading, but the broad point should be clear. कुछ इसमें ऐसा नहीं कि कोई दे रहा है किसी को कुछ. I'm purchasing at a price, I'm selling it at a particular price, and I'm getting interest on the loan that I've given. Chalo. I think that's it. Take care everybody. यहाँ पे चैट पोर्टल वाले क्वेश्चंस आई विल नॉट बी एबल टू आंसर नाउ. काफी सारे क्वेश्चंस होने चाहिए. आई थिंक आरबीआई से जिम्मेदार बनो. बिल्कुल सही. अरे वैभव यार, ओ वैभव परफेक्टली राइट. कार्बन क्रेडिट कॉन्सेप्ट की तरह. आई थिंक दिस इज द फर्स्ट, यार क्या बात है वैभव. दिस इज द फर्स्ट टाइम आई थिंक इन माई मेमोरी दैट आई हैव नॉट यूज्ड द एग्जाम्पल ऑफ क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल to explain PSLCs. I think this is the first time. In all other batches where I've explained PSLCs, I've explained it with the example of carbon credit, Kyoto Protocol. बिल्कुल उसका example लेके मैं explain करता हूँ. Maybe because क्योंकि हर बैच में जब भी मैं पूछता हूं तो सब लोग बोलते हैं सर एनवायरमेंट की क्लासेस अभी तक नहीं हुई हैं, तो दे डोंट नो व्हाट कार्बन ट्रेडिंग इज, व्हाट क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल इज. तो दैट इज व्हाई maybe this time I missed out accidentally, but in every batch I explain PSLC's trading using the example of carbon trading. ठीक है, थैंक यू. चलो आपने याद दिलवाया, तो आपके बैच में भी मेंशन जिक्र हो गया इस चीज का. Okay then, ठीक है. So we'll see each other tomorrow. Questions which are there in chat portal, I am not answering. देखो सही पोर्टल वो है, यहाँ पे मैं आंसर कर देता हूँ. If there is something that needs to be resolved, please ask tomorrow. Please ask the coordinator and she'll forward the questions to me and then I'll answer from them. ठीक है, चलो take care everybody. Good night, goodbye. It's 8:25 already, so we have exceeded 3 hours time. Bye bye, take care. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll discuss NPS. Take care. Tata.